The air within the highest meditation chamber of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant was still, so perfectly still that the motes of dust hanging in the sunbeams that lanced through the arched windows seemed frozen in time, each a tiny suspended galaxy, a mirror of the greater galactic civilization the Jedi Order had sworn to protect, a civilization that, in this moment of profound tranquility, felt distant, almost abstract. A concept rather than a collection of trillions of souls going about their lives in blissful ignorance of the delicate threads that held their peace together. Threads the Jedi watched over, their vigilance a silent, eternal sacrament. Master. Zar Lestin breathed in the scent of ancient stone, of polished wood, of ozone from the city planet's endless energy grid. It was the scent of order, of stability, of a peace hard-won and meticulously maintained for 1,000 generations. He released the breath, and with it, he released a tremor of disquiet. That had been growing in his heart for months, a faint, discordant hum in the Force that was growing steadily louder, a note of dissonance in the great symphony. He was old. Old enough that his green leku were shot through with silver, old enough to have seen cycles of conflict and resolution, to have learned the hard lesson that the light was most often preserved not by dramatic acts of heroism, but by patient, unwavering commitment to principle, by the refusal to be drawn into the passions and conflicts that inevitably consumed the short-lived civilizations of the galaxy. The Jedi were the guardians of the long view, the shepherds of the light across centuries, not mere soldiers for the political emergencies of the day. This was the wisdom of the Council, a wisdom he had upheld and defended his entire life. Yet the disquiet would not fully release. It clung to him, a cold dew on the warmth of his certainty. The reports from the Outer Rim were no longer mere dispatches. They were screams echoing across the light years, screams the Council heard but refused to answer with anything but calm, measured deliberation. The Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, a name from history texts suddenly made terrifyingly real. They were a storm of iron and fire sweeping through the Rim worlds, not as raiders, not as pirates, but as a unified, relentless crusade. Their tactics were brutal, their ethos one of absolute war. They did not conquer for resources or territory alone. They conquered to prove their strength, to forge their identity in the crucible of conflict, and the Republic, soft and complacent, after centuries of peace, was shattering before them, its fleets outmaneuvered and obliterated, its armies retreating in disarray, its senators squabbling over budgets and trade routes, while entire sectors burned, and the cries for the Jedi to intervene were growing into a roar of desperation and betrayal. The galaxy's protectors were silent, invisible, absent in its hour of greatest need. Zar understood the Council's position. He felt the truth of it in his bones. To commit the Jedi to a war of this scale was to risk everything they were. War was a path to the dark side. It demanded choices that eroded the spirit. It fostered anger, hatred, fear, the very emotions a Jedi was taught to release, to master. To send Jedi into the meat grinder of the Mandalorian war machine was to risk creating a generation of Jedi who knew nothing but combat, who had been forged in violence and would carry its scars forever. They might win the war, but they would lose themselves, and in doing so, they would lose the future. The dark side clouded everything around this conflict. The Council could feel it, a presence, a manipulation, a cold, patient intelligence lurking behind the fervor of the Mandalorians. To rush in was to play into the hands of this unseen enemy, to be manipulated into a conflict that would weaken the Republic and the Jedi for a far greater threat waiting in. The Wings, this was the wisdom of caution, the wisdom of patience. It was a heavy, lonely wisdom, one that made them appear cowardly, heartless, detached from the suffering they were sworn to prevent. And within the Order itself, this wisdom was becoming a fault line, a schism between the old masters who saw the centuries-long tapestry and the younger knights, who saw the blood soaking the here and now. The young knights, they burned with a passion for justice, a fervent desire to act, to protect, to defend. They saw the council's inaction not as wisdom, but as a failure of nerve, a betrayal of the Jedi's most fundamental duty. And at the center of this growing storm of dissent was a single figure, a knight whose brilliance was already legend, whose charisma was a gravitational force that pulled others into his orbit. Revan. He was not the loudest voice, not the most openly rebellious, but he was the most compelling. He had fought on the Rim. He had seen the Mandalorian tactics firsthand. He had studied them, understood them in a way the Council on Coruscant never could, and he had begun to formulate responses, strategies of breathtaking audacity and chilling effectiveness. When he spoke in the council chambers, his questions were not challenges. They were surgical incisions, cutting to the heart of the council's paralysis. His silence after their pronouncements was more damning than any outburst. A quiet judgment that hung in the air long after he had left. He was gathering followers, those who believed as he did, that to stand aside while evil acted was to be complicit in its actions, that the Jedi's first duty was to life, not to. A philosophical ideal of purity, they called themselves Revanchists, a name that spoke of taking up a mantle the council had let fall. Zar felt the tension in the Force, a web of cracks spreading through the foundation of the Order. He looked out over the endless cityscape of Coruscant, the towers gleaming in the setting sun, the streams of speeders like rivers of light, the trillions of lives, each a tiny spark. In the Force, living, loving, fearing, they trusted the Jedi. They believed in the myth. They did not know that their protectors were locked in a silent, desperate debate over their very souls, a debate between the compassion that sought to save them now and the wisdom that sought to preserve the light for all time. And Zar, in his heart, felt the cold sliver of doubt grow. Was this wisdom? Or was it the pride of an ancient order too rigid to adapt, too afraid to face a new kind of darkness? Was their inaction itself a choice, an action that would have consequences far more devastating than any intervention? He could feel the true threat now, not just the Mandalorians, but the vast, ancient darkness that moved behind them, a shadow in the Force so deep it promised to swallow all light. And the terrible, unanswerable question formed in his mind. Were they, the Jedi High Council, by refusing to fight the instrument, ensuring the victory of the true architect? The silence of the temple, he feared, was not the peace they cherished, but the quiet before the end of everything. The chamber was not merely a room, but a crucible, a geometric space where ideology and reality were being forced into a violent, unsustainable collision. The air, usually thrumming with the serene and harmonious currents of the light side of the Force, was now thick, heavy, choked with the psychic residue of horror and the unyielding weight of impending decision. The 12 members of the Jedi High Council sat in their circle, their faces etched with the lines of centuries of combined wisdom and a burden of responsibility. That would have crushed a lesser being. They were not evil. They were not cowards. They were the guardians of a flame so precious and so fragile that the slightest gust of wind from a reckless action could snuff it out for 1,000 years. And before them stood the embodiment of that reckless action, though he did not yet know it himself. Revan, still clad in the dust-stained robes of a returning traveler, not a general, not a conqueror, but a witness, a bearer of testimony that threatened to shatter the very foundations of the Council's carefully maintained reality. At his side, a half-pace behind and radiating a heat of pure, undiluted fury, stood Malak, his jaw a hard line, his broad shoulders tense, his presence in the Force a storm cloud of indignation and impatience. They had not requested this audience. They had demanded it, bypassing protocol, their ship landing directly on the temple's sacred precincts, a statement in itself. The holoprojector in the center of the chamber had just flickered out, its light dying, But the images it had seared into the minds of every present Jedi would not fade so easily. They were not simple recordings. They were memory impressions, raw and unfiltered, poured directly from Revan's mind into the projector, a technique. Of testimony reserved for the most profound and traumatic of events, the Council had not seen pixels and light. They had felt the searing heat of Cathar's atmosphere, burning with the fires of its dying cities. They had smelled the acrid tang of ozone and melted plasteel, the coppery scent of blood soaking into fertile soil. They had heard the silence, the most terrible sound of all, the silence that follows a scream abruptly cut short, the silence of a world whose entire population had been systematically, efficiently, utterly erased. They had felt the final, collective pulse of fear and despair from a people being hunted to extinction, a wave of darkness in the Force, so profound it had caused several masters to physically recoil. The images showed the Mandalorian Crusaders, not as soldiers, but as artisans of slaughter. Their movements precise, their actions devoid of rage or hatred, which was somehow worse. It was a genocide conducted with the cold professionalism of a civic maintenance project. The grass would grow again. The cities could be rebuilt. But the people, the culture, the essence of Cathar was gone. A negative space in the Force where a vibrant world had once been. The silence that followed the projection's end was longer and deeper than any that had come before. It was the silence of a funeral, the silence of absolute, unimaginable loss. It was Master Vrook Lamar who finally broke it, his voice a dry rasp, like stone grinding on stone, stripped of all emotion, not out of indifference, but out of a desperate need to cling to analytical distance. The scale of this atrocity is unprecedented in our current age, he began, his eyes not on Revan, but on some middle distance, as if reading from a script of principles written in the air. The horror of it is not, and cannot be, in question, the suffering of the Cathar. People is a wound in the Force that will take generations to heal. The question that lies before this council, however, is not one of grief, but of response. What is the Jedi response to such an act? Do we, in our outrage, add more violence to a galaxy already drowning in it? Do we take up the sword and become soldiers? Do we become killers? And in embracing that path, do we not risk losing the very light we seek to preserve, the very compassion that defines us? Do we become the very thing we seek to destroy? His words were calm, logical, the bedrock of Jedi philosophy for a millennium. But in the wake of the horror they had just witnessed, they sounded hollow, academic, a lecture on fire safety delivered to someone whose house was already ablaze. Revan did not move. His calm was unnerving, a placid lake over unimaginable depths. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, yet it carried through the chamber with the resonance of a struck bell. Every syllable precise. We preserve the light, Master Lamar, by ensuring there are beings left to see it, by ensuring there are eyes to witness the dawn. Your inaction, your deliberation, is not neutrality. It is a choice. You have chosen to let the Mandalorians proceed unchallenged. You have chosen the deaths of billions over the risk of staining our own hands. You have chosen the abstract purity of the Order over the concrete lives of those we are sworn to protect. That is not the Jedi way I was taught. I was taught that we are defenders of the peace. The word defenders hung in the air, heavy with implication. From his seated position, the small, wise form of Master Vander Tokari stirred, his large eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. And the greatest defense of peace, young one, is to not begin a war that may last for generations, to not unleash a cycle of violence from which the galaxy may never recover. To fight this war, we would have to become like them. We would have to embrace their tactics, their strategies of annihilation and terror. We would have to make choices daily, hourly, that would scar our souls, that would haunt the Order for 1,000 years, we must be better than our enemies. Revan, we must hold to the light, even when it is hardest, especially when it is hardest. Or we simply become them, a mirror image of the darkness we fight, and then the light is truly lost. His words were gentle, filled with the compassion that Brooks lacked. But the conclusion was the same. Wait, watch, be patient. Trust in the Force. It was Malek who could bear it no longer. The dam of his restraint broke. With respect, Master Vander, he said, the words laced with a respect that his tone utterly contradicted. They are not giving us that choice. They are not interested in whether we are better. They are not interested in our philosophy. They are only interested in whether we are dead. They are not a political entity to be negotiated with. They are a force of nature, a wildfire. And you don't reason with a wildfire. You fight it, you contain it, you burn a break around it to stop its spread, even if you have to sacrifice a forest to save the continent. His analogy was crude, blunt, but starkly effective. It was the language of a soldier, not a philosopher. Revan placed a subtle, calming hand on Malak's arm, a gesture that spoke of their long partnership. But his eyes, sharp and intense, remained locked on the council. You speak of a war that may last generations. I speak of a war that will be over in a year, 2 at most, if we engage now with purpose, with a strategy that understands the enemy. The Mandalorians are a blunt instrument. For all their ferocity, they respect only strength. They understand only victory. Their culture is built upon it. Their tactics, for all their initial success, are predictable to anyone who studies them without fear. Their supply lines are overextended. Their unity is new and fragile, built entirely on the charismatic will of Mandalore himself. Break that will, shatter that myth of invincibility, and the entire crusade collapses back into 1,000 squabbling clans. We can do this. We can end this, but not from these chambers. Not through meditation and debate. We must meet them in the field. We must speak to them in the only language they comprehend, the language of utter defeat. Master Zar Leston, who had remained silent, his heart heavy with the same doubts that had plagued him in his meditation, leaned forward, his expression pained. Revan, your passion, your certainty, it is a powerful thing, but it blinds you to the larger tapestry. The dark side clouds everything around this conflict. We feel it, a presence behind the Mandalorians, a manipulation, a shadow pulling strings. To rush in is to play directly into the hands of this greater enemy, to expend our strength on the puppet while the puppeteer watches and grows stronger. It was the most compelling argument, the one that gave even Revan a moment's pause. The sense of a vast, patient evil waiting in the wings was a chill in his own bones. But the memory of Cathar, the silence, was louder. Then we will face that enemy when he reveals himself. Revan said, his voice final, absolute, containing a resolve that brooked no further argument. But first, we must survive the one he has sent to our door. I will not stand by and watch the Republic burn to preserve the theoretical purity. Of my own soul, the cost of that purity is too high. It is paid in the blood of innocence, and I, for one, will not be its creditor. He turned, his cloak swirling around him with a finality that echoed through the chamber, and walked out, Malak casting one last, seething glare at the assembled masters before following. The council did not stop them. They could not. The schism was not yet full, but it was real. It existed now in the space between those who left and those who stayed. In the days that followed, the Jedi Temple on Coruscant transformed from a place of serene contemplation into a hive of tents. Whispered debates, the corridors, usually filled with the soft murmur of lessons and the calm footsteps of robed figures, now echoed with heated discussions held in hushed, urgent tones behind half-closed doors. The news of Revan and Malak's audience and their subsequent departure had spread through the ranks of the Jedi like an electric current. For the younger knights and Padawans, it was a catalyst, a validation of the restless. frustrated energy they had felt for months. They saw Revan not as a rebel, but as a hero, the only one willing to act while the council deliberated itself into irrelevance. For the older masters, it was a tragedy, the first crack in the foundation of the Order, a dangerous slide towards the militarism and emotionalism that had always been the precursors to the dark side. The council itself was divided, though they presented a unified front of calm authority. Behind closed doors, masters like Zar Lestin argued for a reconsideration of their stance, warning that their inaction was creating the very problem they sought to avoid. While traditionalists like Vrook Lamar held firm, insisting that to bend was to break. That principle was the only thing that would see them through the coming darkness. Revan and Malak did not renounce their membership. They issued no declarations. They made no grand speeches of defiance. Their actions were their statement. They gathered their personal effects from their Spartan quarters within the temple. They walked the familiar halls one last time, not as penitents, but as determined figures on a mission, and others joined them. It began as a trickle, a knight here, a Padawan there, slipping away in the night, leaving datacrons of resignation on their beds. Then it became a stream, then a river. Mostly it was the young, those who had not yet had their passion tempered into the patient, often passive, wisdom of the council. They were the warriors, the healers who could not stand to watch patients die without fighting the cause of the injury. The scholars who believed knowledge was meant to be applied, not just archived. They were the ones who felt the gnawing guilt every time a news report filtered in from the Rim. Another world fallen, another population enslaved. They believed, to their core, that to do nothing was a sin, a betrayal of the very compassion the Jedi claimed to uphold. They flocked to the landing bays where Revan's ship and the handful of others that followed him were preparing for departure. They came with nothing but their lightsabers, their robes, and a fierce, burning need to make a difference. They became known as the Revanchists, a name taken from a critic's insult and worn as a badge of honor. It meant they were taking up a mantle the council had let fall. They were Revanchists for the very soul of the Jedi Order, for its promise to protect. Their departure was a tremor that shook the Republic to its core. The Senate, which had been pleading for Jedi aid for years, was suddenly presented with it, just not in the form they expected. These were not the serene negotiators of legend. These were soldiers, grim-faced and determined, and their leader was a tactical genius whose name began to spread through the galaxy like a promise to some and a threat to others. The war did not turn overnight. The Mandalorians were too entrenched, too powerful, too confident. But the nature of the conflict changed fundamentally with the arrival of the Revanchists. Revan's strategy was a thing of brutal, beautiful, and terrifying efficiency. He did not meet the Mandalorians head-on at their strongest points, where their warrior culture thrived on direct confrontation. Instead, he dissected them. He had spent the early months of the conflict not in retreat, as many believed, but in intense, obsessive study. He had learned their language, not just the words, but the nuances, the idioms, the cultural touchstones. He had studied their customs, their rituals of war, their songs of mourning and victory. He understood that to a Mandalorian, a battle was a conversation, a test of worth, a dialogue conducted with weapons and tactics. And so he learned to speak their language fluently, the only language they truly respected, the language of utter, humiliating, and decisive defeat. His first major engagement as the de facto leader of this new Jedi-led force, the Battle of Sirocco, became a masterpiece of ruthless, immoral calculus. Republic intelligence indicated a massive Mandalorian force was moving to envelop a key mid-rim system. Sirocco was a fertile agricultural world, its vast plains and rolling fields feeding a dozen sectors. It was an obvious, strategic target. The old Republican Admiralty, trained in classical tactics, wanted to fortify it, to pour resources into its defense, to make a heroic stand. Revan saw a different path, a colder equation. He allowed the Mandalorians to believe their approach was undetected. He subtly pulled back Republic patrols. He let leaks slip through intelligence networks. He made it appear that Sirocco was vulnerable, ripe for the taking. He let them commit their entire force to the orbital bombardment, to revel in the destruction of the planet below, to believe they had caught their enemy napping, while the true Republic fleet, the core of his new revanchist forces, waited silent and powered down on the far side of the system's largest moon, a frozen ball of rock that offered perfect sensor shadow. He did not try to save Sirocco. He calculated its loss. He used the planet, its brave but doomed defenders, and its civilian population as the bait in a trap of astronomical proportions. When the Mandalorian fleet was fully engaged, its attention fixed on the world below, its formations tight and confident, he sprang the trap. His ships fell upon them. From their blind spot, their attacks coordinated with a precision that was almost artistic. And in a single, furious, merciless engagement, he destroyed nearly a third of the Mandalorian main battle fleet. The Republic press and the Senate celebrated a major victory, the first real turning point in the war, a sign that the tide could be turned. But on the bridge of his flagship, watching the burning world of Sirocco on the view screen, its atmosphere stained with smoke, and its surface glowing with the fires of its dying cities, Revan showed no emotion, no triumph, only a cold, grim satisfaction. It was a necessary cost, a horrific equation where thousands had died to save millions elsewhere, to break the enemy's strength and shatter their aura of invincibility. It was the first true, conscious step on his new path, the path of necessary choices, the path where the ends justified the means. And the ends were victory, survival, the preservation of the whole, no matter the cost to the parts. The campaign stretched on, a brutal, grinding slog across the stars. Each victory was bloodier than the last, each choice harder, more morally ambiguous. Revan's strategies grew more complex, more layered, more utterly ruthless. He was evolving, shedding the last vestiges of Jedi pacifism like a skin, becoming something new. A general who saw the galaxy not as a collection of living worlds, but as a vast tactical map, its populations as assets and liabilities, its planets as terrain to be used or sacrificed. His connection to the Force changed. It was no longer a tool for meditation and peace. It was a weapon, a sensor array, a computational engine. He could feel the ebb and flow of battlefields light years away, predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, sense the moment of maximum vulnerability, and strike without hesitation or mercy. His friend Malak evolved too, but differently, where Revan became colder, more focused, more internalized, his emotions locked away in a vault of pure purpose. Malak embraced the fury of combat, the raw, untamed power of the Force unleashed, the thrill of victory, the adulation of the soldiers who followed them. He was the fist to Revan's brain, the brutal, straightforward executor of his friend's brilliant, often terrifyingly complex plans. He enjoyed the fight, the feeling of his lightsaber cutting through Mandalorian iron, the roar of the crowd, the fear in his enemy's eyes. He began to see the war not just as a necessary evil, but as a proving ground, a glorious crucible where strength was the only true virtue, and Revan was its greatest prophet, the one who had shown them the way to true power through action. The bond between them remained strong, but it was changing, warping under the pressures of command and the constant exposure to violence. Revan was the strategist, the mind. Malak was the champion, the sword, and the sword began to love the feeling of blood. And it all culminated at Malachor V, a dead world in a dead system, a gravitational anomaly and a bad memory on the star charts, a place of ill omen and dark legends. It was here that Revan devised his masterstroke, his endgame. The Mandalorian forces, though bloodied by a year of relentless, unconventional warfare, were still powerful, still unified under the formidable leadership of Mandalore the Ultimate. They needed a decisive blow, a victory so absolute, so terrifying in its finality, that it would shatter their spirit completely and forever. Revan gave them one. He feigned a retreat, allowing the Republic fleet to appear broken, disorganized, fleeing in a panicked route towards the Malachor system. A desperate, last-ditch move by a defeated commander. Mandalore, confident from years of victory, perhaps overconfident, and frustrated by Revan's elusive tactics, took the bait. He committed his entire fleet, every ship, every warrior, to the pursuit, to the final annihilation of the Republic's best and most annoying general. The two armadas met in a cataclysmic engagement above the barren world. Ships burning, fighters dying in swarms. The battle was a stalemate, a brutal, grinding meat grinder consuming both sides at a terrifying, unsustainable rate. It was exactly what Revan had planned for. The Mandalorian fleet was exactly where he wanted it, fully committed, unable to disengage, its attention completely focused on the battle. Then, he activated the weapon. It was a prototype, a terrifying piece of technology built in secret base on ancient, partially understood Iokath schematics, a gravitational shadow generator. Its activation, deep within the planet's crust, created an artificial gravity well of unimaginable power, a vortex of distorted physics that pulled everything within its reach toward the planet's surface. Ships, both Mandalorian and Republic, were torn from their formations, dragged down, crushed against each other and against the planet's surface in a cataclysm of metal and fire. Life signs vanished from the scanners by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. In a matter of minutes, the war was over. The silence that fell over the fleet was more deafening than the roar of battle had been. On the bridge of his command ship, safely positioned at the very edge of the effective range, Revan watched the silent, flashing lights of dying ships on the tactical display. His face a mask of calm detachment, a commander clinically assessing the successful outcome of a tactical simulation. Beside him, Malak stared, his face pale beneath his beard, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awestruck admiration, his knuckles white where he gripped the console. Revan, by the Force, it's a graveyard, he whispered, his voice hoarse, cracking with the strain. The scale of the destruction was beyond comprehension. Beyond morality, it was a fact of physics, of strategy, a new terrible star in the galaxy's military history. Revan's voice was quiet, devoid of triumph, devoid of remorse, devoid of anything at all. It was the voice of a man who had already left the battlefield far behind, who was already thinking of the next war. The next threat, it is victory, Malak. It is the only language they understand. It is the only lesson they will heed. It is over. But it was not over on the surface, amidst the twisted, smoldering ruins of fallen starships, in a landscape that had become a monument to death. Revan faced Mandalore the Ultimate. The great leader was beaten, his legendary armor cracked and scorched, his forces annihilated. His great crusade ended in ash and silence. Revan did not gloat. He did not offer a speech. He demanded answers. Why? Why this crusade? What was the purpose? Who was behind it? And Mandalore, in his final moments, laughed a bitter, broken sound that echoed terribly in the desolate landscape. You think you have won, Jedi. You have only passed the first test. You have only broken the tool. The hand that wielded it remains. The true war is coming. A war for which you are not ready. You have proven strong, ruthless, and so you have earned a warning. Beware the Sith Emperor. Beware the Empire in the dark. And with those final cryptic words, he died. The war was over. The Mandalorians were broken, scattered. The Republic was saved. Revan was hailed as the greatest hero of the age, the savior of the Republic, but he did not return to Coruscant for parades and medals. He stood amidst the ruins of Malachor V, the echoes of 1,000,000 deaths screaming in the Force. A wound in reality, that would never fully heal. And he knew, with a certainty that was colder than the vacuum of space, that Mandalore's last words were not the ravings of a defeated foe. They were a warning, a key to a lock he had only just discovered. And the hero who had made the hardest choices to save the galaxy knew, with a dread that settled in his bones like a perpetual frost, that his work was only just beginning. The path of necessary choices had only just opened before him, and it led into a darkness far deeper and far more ancient than any he had yet faced. The silence that followed the cataclysm of Malachor V was a physical presence on the bridge of the newly christened flagship. The Leviathan, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the very hum of the hyperdrive, the faint electrical whisper of the consoles, the hushed breathing of the crew. It was the silence of a grave, a silence they had all purchased with the lives of thousands of their comrades, and the complete annihilation of an enemy fleet, a silence that felt less like peace and more like the vacuum of space, an absolute absence of something that should have been there. The cheers, the sighs of relief, the congratulations, they were absent. The crew, the hardened veterans of the revanchist movement, moved through their duties with a hollow, mechanical precision, their eyes avoiding the main view screen, which still showed the fading afterglow of the gravitational shadow generator's activation, the occasional glitter of debris that had been a ship, a life, a story. They had followed Revan to the end. They had trusted his strategy, his brutal, flawless calculus, and it had worked. They were alive, they were victorious, and yet they felt like mourners at their own funeral. The cost of the victory was a phantom limb, an ache in the soul that no amount of rationalization could soothe. For Revan, standing motionless before the view screen, the silence was not empty. It was filled with the echo of a single voice, the last, rasping words of Mandalore the Ultimate, a voice that played on a loop in his mind, a relentless knowing question that had been planted in the fertile ground of a conscience already scarred. By the calculus of total war, the true war is coming, a war for which you are not ready. Beware the Sith Emperor. Beware the Empire in the dark. The words were not the boastful, defiant threats of a defeated warrior seeking a final measure of pride. They were something else entirely. They were a warning, a passing of a torch from one weapon to another, a final, cryptic intelligence briefing from a general who knew his entire campaign had been a diversion, a feint for a much larger, much darker purpose. Revan, whose entire being was now wired to perceive threat, to analyze strategy, to see 10 moves ahead on the galactic chessboard, could not dismiss them. The Mandalorian Wars had been too convenient, too perfectly designed to test the Republic, to probe its defenses, to strain its resources and its spirit to the breaking point. It had the feel of a field test, a live fire exercise conducted by a distant, unseen general. And the Republic, the Jedi, they had barely passed, and only because Revan had been willing to break every rule, to sacrifice every principle, to achieve victory, a victory that now felt like the end of the first chapter, not the conclusion of the book, the official story, the one meticulously crafted and fed to the Galactic Senate, and the relieved, anxious Jedi Council was one of noble pursuit, of a duty seen through to its absolute end. Revan, the heroic, if grim, general, would take his fleet, the hardened veterans who understood the necessity of his methods, and he would hunt down the last remnants of the Mandalorian forces. He would pursue the scattered clans to the very edges of known space, ensuring they could never again unite under a single banner and threaten the galaxy. It was a story everyone in the core worlds believed, because they desperately needed to believe it. It was clean, it was simple, it fit the comfortable narrative of the noble warrior who cleans up his own mess. It allowed the Senate to immediately demobilize the bulk of the expensive navy and begin the politically popular, though astronomically costly, process of reconstruction, of sending aid to ravaged worlds, of handing out contracts to powerful corporations. It allowed the Jedi Council, nursing its wounded pride, and its deep anxiety over the Revanch's schism, to recall their wayward nights and begin the long, delicate process of healing, of meditation, of attempting to guide those who had seen such horror and committed such acts back towards the light, or at least into a quiet retirement where they could do no further harm. They watched Revan's fleet depart with a mixture of profound relief and deep trepidation, glad to have his disruptive militant presence gone from the core of Republic politics, but fearful of what he might become out there, on the wild, untamed edge of known space, unmoored from their guidance. They could not see that his trajectory had been set long before, in the council chamber during the debate over Cathar, on the bridge planning the sacrifice of Sirocco, in the command center as he gave the order to activate the mass shadow generator. At Malachor V, he was not unmoored. He was laser-focused on a destination only he could sense, a truth only he had been deemed strong enough, or damned enough, to uncover. The journey into the unknown regions was not a military campaign. It was a descent, a pilgrimage into a form of madness, a voyage into the absolute negation of order, knowledge, and the comforting laws of physics that governed the civilized galaxy. The navicomputers of the Leviathan and its accompanying fleet, the very best the Republic had to offer, were rendered instantly useless. Their vast databases containing nothing but the ancient, cartographical equivalent of "Here be dragons," scrawled across swirling, uncharted vortices of stars. The hyperlanes that crisscrossed the Republic, like well-paved highways, were a memory, a relic of an ordered, predictable existence. Here, space itself was unstable, chaotic, a roiling sea of anomalies and dangers. Hyperspace travel was a turbulent, terrifying nightmare of rogue gravitational waves that could shake a ship apart, of nebulae that emitted not just radiation, but a psychic static that seeped into dreams, causing nightmares and paranoia among the crew, of stars that pulsed with unnatural, sickly energies that seemed to watch them, to probe their ships with. Malevolent curiosity. Navigation was not a science here. It was an art, a feeling, a terrifying act of faith that pushed the fleet's navigators to the brink of despair. Revan became their only guide, their sole point of reference in the infinite chaos. He withdrew from the day-to-day command of the fleet, delegating those duties to an increasingly anxious Malak, and retreated to his Spartan quarters for hours, sometimes days on end. He sat in a deep, trance-like meditation, but it was unlike any Jedi meditation taught on Dantwan. It was not a gentle opening of oneself to the unifying river of the Force. It was an aggressive, focused act of will, a throwing of his consciousness outwards like a grappling hook, not through the light side's gentle currents, but through a darker, more primal, more visceral current of the Force. He followed the trail of the Mandalorians, not their physical path through the stars, which was impossible to determine, but the psychic scar they had left in the fabric of reality, a wound of rage, of fervent purpose, of blind obedience that led ever deeper into the screaming void. He followed the faint, chilling echo of Mandalore's final warning, the psychic fingerprint of the words Sith Emperor that called to him like a siren song, a hook in his mind pulling him inexorably towards its source. The crew, the battle-hardened, veterans who had followed him through the fires of Malachor without question, now felt their resolve fraying, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by the constant, shrieking alarms of proximity alerts, by the sight of space twisting itself into impossible, non-Euclidean shapes outside the viewports, by the growing, oppressive silence of their commander, who spoke less and less, whose presence on the ship became less that of a man and more like a ghost, felt only as a cold, focused pressure in the air, a palpable intent that permeated the very durasteel walls of the ship. Malak was his only constant, his only conduit to the fading world of men and mundane concerns, where Revan became more withdrawn, more ethereal, a mind consumed by a single purpose. Malak became more solid, more grounded, he was the one who walked. The decks, who slapped nervous crewmen on the back, who drank with the soldiers in the mess hall, who projected an aura of brute, unshakable confidence. He laughed in the face of the strange phenomena, calling them tricks of the void, phantoms to frighten children. He bolstered the men's spirits with bold promises of glory and unimaginable plunder waiting for them at the end of their journey. A reward for their courage and loyalty, but even his bluster was a thin mask, a performance for the crew. In the stark, private solitude of Revan's chambers, his questions were more pointed. His own doubt began to show through the cracks in his bravado. How much further, Revan? The men are on edge. The ship's engineers report stress fractures in the primary hull from the last gravity shear. We are burning fuel and supplies chasing a ghost. The ravings of a dying man who wanted to leave us with a nightmare. Revan's answers were never satisfying. They were cryptic, delivered in a flat, distant tone, his eyes seeing things far. Beyond the confines of the room, the path is clear to those who have the eyes to see. Malak, we are close. The darkness is gathering. Can you not feel it? It is like a pressure, a weight on the soul, a great eye beginning to open, turning its gaze upon us. Malak felt only a deep, formless unease, a primal sense of being watched, of being sized up from the infinite, hungry blackness outside, but his faith in Revan, the bond forged in 100 battles, was the one unshakable pillar in his life. If Revan said there was a threat, there was a threat. If Revan said they must press on into this madness, then press on they would. He trusted the strategy, even when he could not see the board. After weeks that bled into months of relentless, terrifying travel, of nightmares given form in the void, they found the first tangible clue. Not a planet, not a base, but a graveyard, a silent, frozen drift of wreckage floating in the absolute zero of the space between stars. The ships were ancient, their designs unlike anything in Republic archives, or even the oldest Mandalorian histories. Their architecture was brutal, angular, utilitarian, yet adorned with terrifying, spiraling glyphs and symbols that seemed to drink the light from the distant stars, making the space around them seem even darker. They were unmistakably Mandalorian, but from a much earlier, lost age, a forgotten fleet, its hulls picked clean by scavengers and the relentless erosion of time. But the manner of their destruction was what chilled Revan to the very core of his being, a cold certainty that confirmed his every fear. They had not been defeated in a grand, heroic battle. They had been systematically, ruthlessly, almost casually dismantled. The damage was precise, surgical, the work of a force so overwhelming, so technologically and martially superior, that the legendary Mandalorian warriors had never stood a chance. This was not a defeat. It was an execution, a display of power, and the message was as clear as the vacuum around them. This is what happens to tools that break, to weapons that fail. Revan knew, with a certainty that was like a physical blow, that this was the work of the power behind Mandalore, the unseen hand that had wielded the Mandalorian crusade as a tool, and then, when it proved inadequate or had served its purpose, had broken it and discarded the pieces. The trail grew warmer. The sense of being watched intensified from a vague unease to a palpable, predatory scrutiny, until finally the fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the coordinates Revan had divined through weeks of torturous meditation. And there it was, the source of the call, the reason for the crusade, the object of his relentless pursuit. The star system was an affront to nature, a perversion of cosmic order that defied comprehension. At its center burned a star, but its light was sickly, dimmed, strangled, as if being drained of its very essence, its life force siphoned away for some unimaginable purpose. And orbiting, it was not a planet, not a collection of moons, but a construct, a space station of such immense, terrifying scale that it defied all logic and engineering principles. It was larger than many inhabited moons, a jagged, asymmetric. Monstrous collection of forged spires, shipyard arms, energy conduits, and docking cradles all fused together into a single city-sized engine of production. It was ancient Rakata design. That much was clear from the archaeological records Revan had studied, but it was a design that had been perfected, industrialized on a nightmarish, apocalyptic scale. This was the Starforge, and it was alive. It did not just build ships. It consumed the star's energy, converting it directly into matter, into armies, into weapons, an endless, self-replenishing tide of war that poured forth from its production. Lines in a constant, silent stream, even from this distance. Its presence in the Force was a deafening, psychic roar, a black hole of avarice, malice, an infinite hunger that pulled at them, called to them, promised them unlimited power, promised them dominion over all they surveyed. It whispered to their deepest desires, their darkest ambitions. On the bridge, the crew stared, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to process the sheer, impossible scale of it, the sheer audacity of its existence. Malak's eyes were wide, not with horror, but with raw, naked avarice, a hunger that transformed his face, stripping away the loyal soldier and revealing the ambitious, power-mad core that had always lain beneath. Revan? He breathed, his voice a reverent, greedy whisper. By the Force. With this, we could rebuild the entire Republic fleet in a week. We could make it invincible. We could rule the entire galaxy. We could have anything we want. He saw the end of struggle, the ultimate weapon, the key to absolute, unchallenged power, the fulfillment of every fantasy he had ever secretly harbored. But Revan was not looking at the Starforge. Not really, he was feeling, his consciousness expanding, pushing past the overwhelming, seductive aura of the ancient space station, probing the deeper, colder darkness that lay behind it, around it. The Starforge was a tool, a magnificent, terrifying tool, but it was not the source. The source was the presence he had felt for months. A vast, patient intelligence that had built this, or commanded those who had, the true enemy. He ignored Malak's fervent, desperate whispers, his own mind racing, calculating, seeing the trap laid bare in its horrifying brilliance. It is a trap, Malak, he said, his voice flat, devoid of the awe that gripped everyone else on the bridge. A beautiful, irresistible trap. It is bait, left here for any power strong enough, ambitious enough, to find it, to covet it, to use it, and in using it, to become a slave to its power, to the dark side energy that fuels it, and ultimately, to the one who truly controls it. We are not. The discoverers, we are the prey being led to the slaughter. He ordered the fleet to hold position, to go to absolute sensor silence, to become just another piece of debris in the void, and for days they waited. They watched the cruise. Initial awe curdling into a deep, creeping dread under Revan's grim silence, and then they saw it, not with their eyes, but through the long-range scanners Revan himself had modified, not to detect energy signatures, but to find distortions in the very fabric of spacetime. Itself a ripple, a tear in reality, a fleeting, terrifying window that opened for a few heartbeats. And in that moment, they saw what lay beyond the void, behind the tempting bait of the Starforge. It was an empire, a civilization of staggering, soul-crushing scope, hidden away in a pocket of reality, folded in upon itself, a secret realm of absolute darkness. There were thousands of worlds, but they orbited stars that burned with a cold black fire, their light illuminating landscapes of obsidian spires and cities built from despair. Fleets of ships, each one larger and more menacing than the Leviathan, drifted in silent, patient, perfect formations, numbers beyond counting. A military force that made the entire Republic Navy look like a local security patrol. And the Force. Here, it was not just absent or quiet. It was twisted, corrupted into a knotted, screaming cord of pure, concentrated hatred, a psychic engine of malice that powered this hidden civilization. This was the true Sith Empire, not the fractured, chaotic remnants of Exar Kun's Brotherhood, but a unified, ancient, and unimaginably powerful entity that had been growing in the darkness for centuries, perhaps millennia, and at its heart, a mind, a consciousness so vast, so ancient, so utterly consumed by the dark side that it felt like a cancer at the center of creation itself, a black sun around which this entire empire of night revolved. The Sith Emperor Vitiate. This was the enemy Mandalore had warned him of. This was the true war, the war that made the Mandalorian conflicts look like a childish squabble, a border skirmish, the Republic, weary, fractured, financially and spiritually bankrupt, led by squabbling politicians and a Jedi Order that had proven itself timid, dogmatic, and utterly obsolete, would be swept aside like dust. It would be not a war, but an extermination, a harvest. The revelation struck Revan with the force of a physical blow. He staggered, his hand going to the console for support. His face, usually a mask of impenetrable calm, was pale, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it was almost religious in its intensity. He saw the future with horrifying, crystalline clarity. He saw the Jedi temple on Coruscant, not just in ruins, but desecrated. A tomb for 10,000 knights whose pacifism became their epitaph. He saw the Senate building a charnel house, the skies of every world from the core to the outer rim, darkened by the endless fleets of the Sith Empire. He saw slavery on a galactic scale, the extinction of entire species, the end of freedom, of hope, of everything the Republic was, everything he had just fought a brutal, soul-damning war to save. And he knew, with a soul-crushing certainty that settled in his bones like a lead weight, that there was only one path, a path so dark, so damning, that it made the gravity well at Malachor V seem like a minor ethical transgression, a necessary tactical choice. This was something else entirely. This was a fundamental rewriting of his own soul. He could not go back. He could not warn the Council. They would not believe him. They would call him mad, a war hero traumatized by his experiences. Or if they did believe the evidence, they would debate. They would form committees. They would seek a peaceful, diplomatic contact with this unspeakable existential evil, and they would be utterly, laughably, pathetically annihilated for their trouble. The only way to save the Republic was to become the one thing it feared more than the Mandalorians. He had to embrace the power he had discovered. He had to use the tools of the enemy. He had to build an army, not for defense, but for conquest. He had to unite the galaxy, by fire and blood if necessary, under a single, ruthless, absolute banner. His banner, he had to forge the Republic and every world around it into a single weapon, a weapon so sharp, so strong, so utterly dedicated to victory and survival that it could possibly, just possibly, survive the coming storm. It meant sacrificing their souls. It meant becoming the monster in the children's stories. It meant damning themselves to save everyone else. He turned to Malak, whose face was still alight with the reflected glory of the Starforge, with dreams of personal power and glory. Revan's voice was not his own. It was the voice of a man who had already crossed the Rubicon, who had already made the choice, who had already died inside so that others might live. They are not ready, Malak. They are asleep. They are children playing at war. We must become the threat that wakes them. We must become the war they understand, to prepare them for the war they cannot comprehend. Malak stared, confused, his dream of easy power interrupted. What are you saying? We have it right there, the ultimate weapon. We can take it. We can destroy any enemy. Revan shook his head, a gesture of infinite weariness, the weight of galaxies on his shoulders. No, you are not seeing it, this. He gestured towards the hidden empire, the vision of which was already fading. From the scanners, This enemy cannot be destroyed by a single weapon. It can only be survived, and to survive, the galaxy must be broken and remade. It must be unified, hardened, turned into a fortress. And we must be the ones to do it. We must take this power. He pointed to the Starforge, not to conquer. For glory, not to rule for our own aggrandizement, but to conquer for survival, to rule, to prepare. We must become the darkness that guards the light. We must become the thing they fear. To protect them from the thing that would devour them, we must become Sith. The word hung in the air between them, final, terrible, absolute. Malek's confusion slowly melted away, replaced by a dawning, fervent understanding. He had always seen power as the end goal, the reward for strength. Now Revan was offering him a justification, a noble, tragic cause for the pursuit of that ultimate power. It was a lie he was all too willing to believe, a mantle he was desperate to wear. So, they returned to the place where it had ended, on the dark side world of Malachor V, in a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the echoes of a million deaths screamed in unison, a place already consecrated to necessary evil. They knelt not in submission, but in grim, determined purpose. They took the names of ancient dark lords, not as inheritors of a legacy of petty evil, but as architects of a terrible, tragic salvation. They embraced the power that flowed from the dark side, not for its own sake, not for the thrill of dominance, but for its utility, its efficiency, its terrifying, unambiguous strength. Revan became Darth Revan, no longer a Jedi general, but a Sith Lord, his heart once filled with a passion to protect, now encased in ice, his mind, once brilliant with strategy, now sharpened to a single deadly point. The end justified the means, and the end was the survival of all life. The means would be the blood of billions, the betrayal of everything he had once held dear. It was the first and greatest of his necessary choices, a choice that would damn him and save the galaxy. And as he felt the dark side flow into him, cold and potent and infinitely seductive, he truly no longer knew if there was a difference. The return from the fathomless dark of the unknown regions was not a simple military maneuver, a fleet returning from a long campaign. It was a cosmological event, a fundamental and violent rewriting of the galaxy's established political, spiritual, and psychological reality, a deliberate, terrifying unveiling of a new absolute, the Leviathan, its once proud Republic Hall, now pitted, scarred, and almost unrecognizable from its brutal passage through the chaotic, anomaly-riddled void, its silhouette grotesquely altered by Rakata-inspired modifications that made it appear less a ship of war and more a flying cathedral dedicated to some dark, unspeakable god, emerged from the twisting currents of hyperspace, not as a lone herald, but as the grim spearhead of an armada that defied all contemporary understanding and shattered all preconceived notions of power. The ships that followed it into the serene, ordered space of the Outer Rim were not mere vessels of war. They were pronouncements made solid, their very design a violent, philosophical rejection of Republic aesthetics, where Republic ships were rounded, flowing, designed for efficiency, comfort, and a certain noble elegance. These new ships were angular, dagger-sharp, aggressive even in their stationary silence, their hulls a non-reflective, abyssal black that seemed to absorb light, hope, and curiosity in equal measure, adorned with sharp, crimson sigils that evoked ancient nightmares and forbidden knowledge. They moved with a silent, predatory grace that spoke of a technology, not just incrementally advanced, but fundamentally different, born not from generations of iterative design, but from a single, dark, revelatory source. This was not a fleet built in the sprawling, noisy, politically connected shipyards of Kuat or Fonder. It was a fleet birthed from the heart of a star itself, forged in the silent, terrible fires of the Starforge, an infinite, self-replenishing tide of war that now poured into the civilized galaxy like a flood of night with a single terrifying, unwavering purpose. The purpose of its architect, its general, its dark messiah, Darth Revan. The first encounter, the first communication between the known, comfortable galaxy and this new, incomprehensible power was not a dialogue. It was a statement, a message written not in words or even in warning shots, but in pure, unadulterated, annihilating force. A small Republic border patrol, a trio of aging, weary Hammerhead-class cruisers named Valor, Vigilance, and Vanguard, tasked with the melancholy, seemingly endless duty of watching for Mandalorian stragglers and providing a thin, fragile semblance of order to a traumatized sector, detected the anomalous mass shadows emerging from hyperspace, their sensor officers, bored and lulled into complacency by months of quiet, initially assumed. It was a Republic reinforcement group, perhaps even Revan's own legendary fleet, returning triumphant from its long mop-up operation in the Outer Rim. Their hails, standard and friendly, filled with the familiar protocols of the Republic Navy, were met with a silence more profound and menacing than any transmission of static. A silence that seemed to suck the air from the command decks. That made the hum of the ship's systems sound suddenly frail. Their scanners, probing the strange, black-holed vessels, rebounded off energy shields that registered with impossible density. The power signatures they detected were off the scale, alien, humming with an energy that felt wrong, defying every known database and physics model. The patrol's commander, a veteran of the wars named Captain Alara Tan, felt a cold, primal dread seep into her bones. This was wrong. This was something new, something her experience could not categorize. And before she could order a retreat to a safer distance, before she could even open a channel to warn Coruscant of this anomalous contact, the lead ship of the unknown fleet, a dagger-shaped vessel, no larger than a heavy corvette, oriented itself with chilling precision. A single cyclopean eye of a weapon glowed a malevolent blood-wine crimson, and it fired not a full volley, not a probing attack, but a single, precise, and utterly annihilating beam of coherent energy that lanced across the void and struck the Valor amidships. There was no glorious explosion, no frantic calls for help, no secondary detonations. One moment the Valor was there, a vessel with a crew of 300 men and women, with lives, families, dreams, and the next, it was an expanding, perfectly spherical cloud of incandescent plasma, its atoms disassociated, its existence erased, the Vigilance and Vanguard, frozen in sheer, paralyzing shock and horror for too precious. Fatal seconds suffered the same obliterating fate. The entire engagement, from emergence to total annihilation, lasted less than 20 seconds, and where 3 ships and 1,000 lives had been, there was now only silent, expanding, superheated debris. The message was delivered, and it was simple, absolute, and terrifying. The rules you lived by are obsolete. The power you understood is insignificant. Your lives are forfeit to a greater purpose. We are here. We are other, and we will not be reasoned with. This was the foundational essence, the brutal, unwavering core of Darth Revan's Sith Empire. It was not an empire built for plunder, for the glorification of a single ruler's ego, or for the chaotic, self-indulgent spectacle of dark side passions. It was an empire constructed with the cold, precise logic of a master engineer, a single, unified weapon, an instrument of such terrifying precision and unforgiving logic that its every component, from the grandest flagship to the lowest infantryman's boot, from its economic policies to its military doctrines, was dictated by a brutal, utilitarian philosophy. The goal was not chaos, but a terrible, iron-fisted order, a forced, absolute unity that would strip away the perceived weakness, the decadence, the endless, paralyzing debate and corruption of the Republic, and forge what remained in the fires of conquest into a blade sharp enough, hard enough, and ruthlessly pragmatic enough to pierce the heart of the true Sith Empire waiting in the dark. The galaxy had to be made ready for a war of extinction, a war against an enemy that would offer no terms, accept no surrender, and understand only absolute domination. And to do that, it first had to be conquered, hardened, unified, and disciplined under a single, unquestioned will his own. The architecture of this new power was a direct, chilling reflection of Revan's own transformed mind. It was cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of the petty cruelties and theatrical indulgences that had characterized previous dark side orders like that of Exar Kun, where Kun's Sith had been artists of chaos, passionate and flamboyant in their evil. Revans were engineers of order, clinical and dispassionate in their application of terror. The Star Forge was the engine, the relentless, throbbing, dark heart of this new war machine. Its innate dark side energy, a constant corrosive influence that seeped into every molecule of the ships it produced, every circuit, every rivet, every inch of durasteel. These vessels were not merely transport or weapons platforms. They were psychic amplifiers, extensions of the Forge's malevolent will, living ecosystems of dark side energy. Serving on them was a unique and grinding form of psychological torture. The ships themselves felt alive and hungry, conscious. In a way that machinery should not be, crews reported intense, shared nightmares when they slept in their racks, waking to find themselves screaming alongside their bunkmates, all describing the same dream of being consumed, of falling into a vast mechanical maw. They experienced heightened aggression during drills, a quickness to anger during mundane tasks, and a gradual, chilling decrease in empathy. A medic who once would have stayed with a wounded comrade through the night might now look at the same injury as a drain on resources, a liability to be jettisoned to improve efficiency. It was a poison, a necessary toxin that Revan knew he was administering to his own forces, the only thing strong enough to harden them, to immunize them against the far greater, more seductive and insidious corruption of the true Sith they would eventually face. It was a vaccine of a lesser evil against a plague of absolute evil. The Forge's greatest tactical advantage, beyond its endless production, was its utter independence from the bloated galactic economy. It allowed Revan to bypass the entire sluggish, corrupt Republic military-industrial complex. There were no procurement committees arguing over budgets for years, no senators demanding lucrative contracts for their homeworld's manufacturers, no labor unions striking for better pay, no bureaucratic inertia delaying deployment for a decade. He was the general, the architect, the factory foreman, and the quartermaster, all in one, a perfect, centralized command economy devoted solely to war. He could analyze battle data from a skirmish in the Tingle Arm, conceive of a countermeasure, a new starfighter design with improved maneuverability, a modification to shield harmonics to counter, a new enemy weapon, a new type of armor-piercing round, and have 10,000 units of it rolling off the assembly lines of the Starforge by the end of the week. This was adaptation and evolution at a pace, the static, committee-driven, politically hamstrung Republic Defense Forces could not hope to match. It was warfare unburdened by morality, production without limit, a terrifying strategic advantage that allowed his forces to constantly stay 10 steps ahead of their bewildered opponents. His recruitment philosophy was a masterpiece of targeted, cynical pragmatism, a deep understanding of the psychology of power and desperation. He did not waste time or resources seeking out the already corrupt or the pathologically evil. He viewed such individuals as unreliable, prone to chaotic self-interest and betrayal, tools of short-sighted villainy that would inevitably undermine the stability and efficiency of his empire. Instead, he sought the strong, the disillusioned, the pragmatic, those who had seen the weakness, inefficiency, and hypocrisy of the Republic firsthand and hungered for something more, something that simply worked, something that offered strength instead of empty promises. The veterans of the Mandalorian Wars were his first and most crucial converts. They were not evil, they were weary, they were disillusioned. They had already walked the path of necessary evil. They had followed him to Sirocco, to Malachor V, and beyond. They understood the horrific calculus of sacrifice for the greater good. They had looked into the abyss to defeat a monster and had not flinched. For them, the switch from Republic hero to Sith enforcer was not a fall from grace, but a lateral move to a more effective, more honest command structure, one that promised decisive action and victory instead of endless debate and political maneuvering. They became his commanders, his officers, the Dark Jedi, who formed the disciplined, lethal backbone of his new order. They were not Sith in the traditional mustache-twirling sense. They did not froth with rage or cackle with lust for power. They were soldiers, grim and determined, who had seen the coming storm and accepted the price of building a shelter, however. Terrible the materials. For the common soldiers, the vast army of occupation and conquest, Revan offered not cosmic power, but something more immediately appealing to those who had known only suffering. Order, purpose, and strength. He targeted his recruitment on worlds that had been neglected by the Republic, on populations that had suffered terribly under the Mandalorian. Boot, on individuals and species who had known only victimhood and chaos. He offered them a chance to be part of something powerful, something that would never be victimized again. His was a message of unity through strength, of peace through absolute, unchallengeable power, and to a galaxy weary of war, uncertainty, and bureaucratic failure. It was a profoundly seductive message. He offered them a uniform, a rank, a clear chain of command, a purpose, and a promise that under his banner, the strong would be protected, and the weak would be either made strong or efficiently purged. It was a brutal social Darwinism presented as a necessary evolutionary step. The contrast with his apprentice, Darth Malak, grew ever starker and more dangerously pronounced as the Empire expanded. It was the central, critical flaw in Revan's otherwise perfect weapon, a flaw of personality and philosophy that the hidden true enemy, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, would observe and exploit with devastating, patient precision, where Revan was cold, calculating, purposeful, a grand strategist who saw the entire galaxy as a complex, four-dimensional board of Dijeric, every piece, movable, every sacrifice calculated against a future outcome only he could see. Malak was hot-headed, brutal, visceral, immediate. He reveled in the raw, sensory experience of power and the visceral thrill of cruelty for its own sake. He saw the conquest not as a means to a greater, nobler end, but as the end goal itself. The power was the reward. The fear was the point. The submission of others was the validation of his own strength. He was the public face of the Sith's terror, the fist that smashed down doors, the roaring voice that demanded absolute groveling. Submission, while Revan was the mind in the shadows, the unseen architect who rarely showed himself, preferring to command from the strategic isolation of the Leviathan or the Starforge. Malak loved the adulation of the troops, the tangible, smellable fear in the eyes of conquered enemies. He embraced the dark side's passion and rage with the Adit's zeal, a zeal that Revan found useful for the specific task of intimidation and for breaking stubborn, localized resistance, but which he also viewed as dangerously short-sighted and ultimately counterproductive to the larger galactic scale project of unification and preparation. Malak's philosophy was simple, primal, immediate: crush resistance, inspire maximum fear, take what you want, enjoy the spoils. He missed the larger picture entirely, the terrifying, galaxy-spanning purpose behind the horror. He was the blunt, crude instrument to Revan's laser scalpel, the raging, uncontrolled inferno to Revan's cold, contained and focused furnace, and the dark side energy of the Starforge, which Revan resisted through sheer titanic force of will and focus on his ultimate goal, fed Malek's baser instincts like pure fuel, making him more aggressive, more impulsive, more arrogantly certain that his way, the way of overwhelming, brutal, immediate force, was the right way. The only way. This fundamental disconnect between master and apprentice, between the long, tragic view and the short, visceral thrill, was the first critical crack in the foundation of Revan's grand design. A weakness in the weapon's hilt. The conquest itself was a clinical, terrifying masterpiece of psychological and military strategy, a reflection of Revan's unique, insider's understanding of his enemy. He knew the Republic. He knew its strengths and its profound systemic weaknesses, its vanity, its complacency, its corruption. He did not simply invade. He subverted, he divided, he conquered from within long before his fleet ever appeared as a speck in a system's sky. His agents, often former Republic officials, disillusioned Jedi, or cunning merchants who understood the system's corruptible pressure points, would infiltrate a target world months, sometimes a year, in advance. They were not saboteurs in the classic sense. They were propagandists, demagogues, and manipulators. They would spread discontent through carefully crafted, widely distributed news reports that highlighted Republic failures and promised Sith efficiency. They would amplify political divisions by secretly funding extremist groups on all sides, creating chaos and gridlock. They would bribe key officials with promises of retained power and privilege in the new regime. And they would subtly sabotage infrastructure power grids, water purification plants, Kung networks to create shortages, erode faith in the ruling government, and foster a general sense of apocalyptic anxiety. By the time the Sith fleet finally appeared in orbit, the planet was often already on the brink of civil collapse, its government paralyzed by infighting and suspicion, its people fearful, angry, hungry, and leaderless. Revan would then offer terms, not to the discredited ruling body, which he had already undermined, but directly to the people, through planet-wide broadcasts that painted him not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, a strong, decisive hand come to cut through the red tape and corruption, to bring order, security, and full employment. He promised an end to the squabbling, an end to the neglect from the distant, decadent core worlds. He promised that under his rule, merit would be rewarded, weakness would be eliminated, and the planet would become a proud, productive part of something greater, something safe from the chaos of the galaxy. Often, this combination of internal decay and the promise of strong, stable, efficient rule was enough. Worlds would surrender. Without a single shot fired from orbit, their populations, weary of chaos, eager for the stability he promised, would even welcome the Sith troops as peacekeepers. For those few, stubborn worlds that resisted, that held fast to their ideals of Republic loyalty, or whose leaders were too principled or too perceptive to be corrupted, Malak was unleashed. His methods were swift, brutal, and absolute, designed not just to defeat, but to terrify any other world that might consider defiance. A city that refused to yield would not be subjected to indiscriminate orbital bombardment, which would damage valuable infrastructure and industry that Revan coveted for his future war effort. Instead, Malak's forces would employ terrifyingly precise strikes. A single, precise turbolaser blast would vaporize the planet's historic Capitol building during a full session of the planetary government, eliminating the entire political leadership in a microsecond. Another blast would obliterate the central temple or museum, the cultural heart of the world, destroying its history and identity. Military bases were systematically dismantled, not with costly infantry assaults, but with overwhelming, demonstrative aerial dominance. The message was clear, cold, and calculated for maximum psychological impact. Resistance is not only futile, it is existentially expensive. It will cost you your history, your identity, your leadership, your soul, while compliance will be rewarded with order, security, and a place in the new, ascending order. It was state-sponsored terrorism on a planetary scale, executed with the cold, efficient precision of a military operation. This dual approach Revan's subtle, pervasive, long-term corruption, and Malak's brutal, exemplary, immediate force made the Sith war machine terrifyingly efficient and adaptable. Revan's strategic mind identified the key pressure points of the Republic, not as its symbolic worlds like Coruscant, but its logistical heart, its hyperlane nexuses, its agricultural breadbasket worlds, its key shipyard systems like Corellia and Sluis Van, and he applied pressure precisely there. He did not seek to occupy every backwater planet, but to control the flow of resources, information, and power, to strangle the Republic slowly, to demonstrate its impotence to its own citizens. The Republic, slow to mobilize, hopelessly bureaucratic, and morally conflicted about fighting the very hero who had just saved them from the Mandalorians, found itself constantly on the back foot, its fleets arriving too late to save systems, its armies bogged down in debates about rules of engagement, its political will eroded by fear, corruption, and a growing sense of inevitability. Revan was not just winning battles, he was winning the narrative. He was proving that his way was stronger, faster, more effective, that the future belonged to order and power, not to democracy and debate. And at the center of it all was the Star Forge, a constant, dark engine producing the tools of conquest, its influence spreading through the fleet like a psychoactive drug, hardening the soldiers, fueling their aggression, binding them to Revan's will through the dark side's seductive promise of power. It was a grim, horrific calculus, but to Revan, every world subjugated, every Republic fleet lured into a trap and destroyed, every Jedi captured, turned, or broken was not a step towards personal dominion, but a step towards preparing the galaxy for the true war. He was building a wall, a fortress of worlds and battleships against the coming night, and he would use every tool, every every ounce of his own soul to make that wall high enough and strong enough to hold. The end justified the means, and the end was the survival of all life. The means were the blood of billions, a price he had already, long ago, in the silent aftermath of Malachor V, agreed to pay without flinching. The Sith Empire of Darth Revan was not a monolith, though to the terrified citizens of the Republic, watching from their worlds as the black-hulled fleets darkened their skies, it appeared as an indivisible, inexorable wave of darkness, a single-minded, faceless engine of conquest that moved, with a chilling, unified purpose. From within, however, from the command decks of its flagships to the stormtrooper barracks on 1,000 occupied worlds, it was a tense, precarious, and ultimately unstable synthesis of two opposing forces, two conflicting, irreconcilable philosophies of power that were bound together only by the immense, terrifying will and unparalleled strategic genius of its architect. This was the fundamental, fatal flaw in Revan's grand design, the crack in the foundation of the dark edifice he was building, a schism that the hidden true enemy, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, perceived across the vast, lightless gulf of space with the cold, patient clarity of a master predator sensing a deep, septic weakness in its chosen prey. On one side was the cold, purposeful, utilitarian vision of Darth Revan, a vision of the Empire not as a kingdom, but as a weapon, a necessary, temporary evil, forged in the fires of a greater, ultimate good, a tool to be used with precision, maintained with ruthless efficiency, and then perhaps, one day, when its grim purpose was finally served, set aside, its architect retiring from the stage of history, his name cursed, but his work, the salvation of all life, complete on the other side, burning with the heat of 1,000 suns, was the hot, passionate, and utterly avaricious ambition of Darth Malak, a vision of the Empire as an end in itself, a glorious, bloody testament to personal strength. a throne of skulls from which to rule a conquered galaxy for its own sake. For the glory, the pleasure, the absolute indulgence of dominion, this fundamental schism, this philosophical civil war fought in the hearts of the two men at the Empire's core, was its original sin, a flaw that would not only unravel the Empire from within, but would, in a single catastrophic moment, render the entire galactic scale project null and void, sacrificing the future on the altar of present petty ambition. The Empire was not yet a full-year-old. Its conquests were proceeding with a speed and efficiency that stunned and demoralized the Galactic Republic. But it was already dying from within, rotting from the core outward like a fruit whose seed had been poisoned at the moment of its planting, and the catalyst for its final, dramatic collapse would not be a brilliant Republic counteroffensive. Not a heroic last stand, but the catastrophic, intimate failure of the bond between the two men who had built it. A bond forged in the fires of the Mandalorian Wars, tempered in the unknown regions, and now shattered by the very dark side power they had sought to harness. The setting for this act of galactic self-destruction was the Quili system, a strategically vital nexus of hyperlanes on the edge of the mid-rim, a linchpin whose control meant dominance over the flow of warships, supplies, and information into an entire quadrant of the Republic. It was a prize the Republic military, despite its losses and confusion, knew it could not afford to lose, and so they had committed a significant portion of their remaining battle-hardened fleet to its defense, a desperate gamble to blunt the Sith advance. Arrayed against them was the main battle fleet of the Sith Empire, a vast armada of dark, silent ships led by the twin pillars of the New Order. Revan's flagship, the Leviathan, a vessel that had become a legend of terror and Malak's command. Ship, the Interrogator, a name that spoke volumes about its master's preferred methods. The battle itself was a brutal, magnificent, and terrible microcosm of the entire war. A swirling, chaotic melee of flashing turbolasers and dying ships, of brave, desperate Republic charges meeting cold, calculated Sith kill zones, Republic tenacity and courage meeting Sith technological superiority and relentless, dispassionate aggression from the isolated, quiet bridge of the Leviathan. Revan was a study in focused, almost detached intensity. His mind, an engine of unparalleled strategic computation, was not solely on the immediate tactical situation of the Quili engagement, which was well in hand, proceeding along the predictable vectors he had foreseen, but was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the next phase, the movement of fleets to exploit this inevitable victory, the political subversion of the surrounding sectors that would now be cut off and ripe for the taking, the resource allocation needed to repair and redeploy. He was playing a game of Dejarik on a galactic scale, and the Quili battle was but a single, albeit important, piece being moved into place. He was distant, absorbed. His attention turned inward to the vast, 4-dimensional strategic map that only he could see, a map that included always the true, hidden enemy waiting in the dark, the Sith Empire of Vitiate, the real war for which all this was merely preparation, this necessary distraction. This critical focus on the long game created a momentary vulnerability, a tiny window of time where the architect was not looking directly at the tool in his hand, and the tool, sensing the lapse, its own edge honed by ambition and dark side whispers, decided it wished to become the hand. Aboard the Interrogator, the atmosphere was entirely different. Darth Malak was in his element. He thrived in the visceral chaos of battle, the roar of the engines, the shudder of the deck, plating under his boots as the forward batteries fired, the primal thrill of seeing Republic ships break apart and vaporize under the concentrated assault of his command. He paced the bridge like a caged rancor, radiating raw, aggressive energy, barking orders, demanding faster firing solutions, closer. Engagement ranges. He was the embodiment of the Sith war machine's fist, but beneath the surface exhilaration, beneath the warrior's joy was a deeper, more corrosive, and ever-growing emotion, a festering resentment that had been planted during the long, lonely journey into the unknown regions and had been fed ever since by the addictive energies of the Starforge and the intoxicating nectar of absolute power. He saw the respect, the awe, the sheer terror that Revan commanded from a distance. He saw the empire they had built together, an empire he had fought for, bled for, whose victories he had personally carved out with his own lightsaber. And he wanted it, not as a steward for Revan's grand, obscure, and seemingly endless design, but as his own solely, completely, the dark side energy that saturated every bolt and beam of the interrogator, which he had embraced wholly and without Revan's philosophical reservations or ultimate purpose, fed this resentment, twisting it from a petty jealousy into an all-consuming, blinding hunger. It whispered to him in the silence between explosions. It spoke of his own strength, of his right to rule, of Revan's weakness in clinging to his old, Jedi-like obsession with a greater good that always seemed to recede over the horizon. It told him that the strong should rule, that power was its own justification, and that he, Malak, was strong. Revan's distant, commanding demeanor, his cryptic pronouncements about a true war that never materialized, his refusal to simply enjoy the fruits of their conquest, all seemed to Malak like the excuses of a leader who was losing his nerve, who was becoming philosophical, weak, unfit to wield the absolute power he commanded. In that specific, fateful moment, watching the Leviathan through the main viewport, a perfect, isolated island of command amidst the chaotic sea of battle, the whispers became a deafening scream in his mind. A festering resentment crystallized into a cold, clear decision. It was not a complex, long-plotted conspiracy, not a carefully orchestrated coup involving dozens of co-conspirators. It was the impulsive, brutally simple act of a man who saw a fleeting opportunity for ultimate power and was too blinded by his own ambition and the dark side's urgings to consider the consequences beyond his own ascension. The order was given, not after long deliberation or a weighing of risks, but in a hot, passionate instant of absolute avarice. Malak turned to his chief weapons officer, his face a terrifying mask of furious determination, and pointed a single accusatory finger at the image of the Leviathan. His voice, when he spoke, was low, guttural, charged with enough dark side energy to make the air crackle. That ship now, full forward barrage, concentrate all fire on the command deck. I want it vaporized. The order was so shocking, so utterly insane, that for a long frozen moment, the entire bridge crew of the interrogator simply stared, their hands hovering over consoles, their minds refusing to process the command. They looked at their lord, then at the flagship of their own fleet, the vessel of the Dark Lord himself, then back at Malak's enraged face. Surely they had misheard. It was a trick, a test of loyalty, a terrible joke, but Malak's following roar brooked no hesitation. It was a wave of pure hatred that washed over them. No, fire. Oh, I will space every one of you worthless vermin and fire the guns myself. The threat was terrifyingly real. His rage was a physical force in the cramped bridge, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The weapons officer, a man whose name history would not record, a man faced with the immediate certainty of a painful, ignoble death or the commission of an unthinkable, traitorous act, chose to live, his hands shaking so violently he could barely input the commands. He bypassed the friendly transponder codes that identified the Leviathan as an ally. He overrode the safety protocols designed to prevent such fratricide. He locked the targeting scanners on the ship's bridge, on the very heart of the Sith Empire, and with a final silent prayer to any god that might be listening, he pressed the firing. Control, the interrogator's entire forward battery, a massive array of turbo lasers and ion cannons designed to punch through the heaviest capital ship shields, erupted in a single coordinated volley of crimson energy. The bolts, a storm of focused annihilation, crossed the short, treacherous distance between the two Sith ships in a heartbeat. They did not splash harmlessly against shields that had been set to allow friendly vessels to approach. They struck home with the force of a small asteroid impact. The command deck of the Leviathan, the nerve center of the entire Sith War effort, the place where Revan's grand design was conceived and executed, ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant, along with everyone on it. The navigators, the tactical officers, the guards, all were turned to atoms in a flash of light, or so Malak believed, convinced that his decisive act had cleared his path to the throne. On the Leviathan, the world did not so much dissolve as it was unmade. The impact was not a mere hit from an enemy weapon. It was an amputation, a decapitation. The heart and brain of the ship were torn out in a cataclysm of fire and screaming metal. The alarms that had been blaring for the external Republic battle were instantly drowned out by the closer, more intimate screams of rupturing durasteel, exploding power conduits, and dying men and women. The ship, suddenly without guidance, its helm controls vaporized, lurched violently like a wounded beast, throwing crewmen against walls, into sparking consoles. The main lights flickered and died, plunging the cavernous interior into a hellish darkness, punctuated only by the frantic red glow of emergency strips and the angry, spitting sparks of severed cables. In the midst of this chaos, amid the smoke and the screams, Revan was thrown from his command chair by the concussive force of the blast, his body saved from immediate incineration, not by foresight or force of will, but by the simple, brutal, and random laws of physics, the angle of the blast. The specific layout of the reinforced bulkheads around the command walkway, the sheer random chance of where he was standing at that precise microsecond. He was not killed, but he was critically, terribly wounded, his body broken, his famous, imposing armor scorched and cracked like a piece of discarded pottery. And most crucially, his mind, that brilliant, unparalleled strategic instrument that held the entire complex plan for galactic salvation, was shattered by the combined force of the physical explosion and the profound psychic backlash of such an intimate, devastating betrayal. The intricate, vast tapestry of memory, identity, purpose, and strategy that was Revan was torn to shreds, unraveled in an instant, leaving behind a blank, smoking slate, a void where a galaxy-spanning consciousness had once resided. In the ensuing confusion, as the Leviathan drifted, crippled and dying, a ghost ship filled with the moans of the wounded and the hiss of escaping atmosphere, a Republic boarding party led by the young, determined Jedi Knight Bastila Shan, whose unique battle meditation had been a key factor in holding the Republic line, managed to fight their way through the disorganized Sith defenders and onto the ship. Their mission, a desperate, high-risk gamble, had been to capture or kill the Sith Lord himself, to decapitate the Empire in one bold stroke, and hopefully turn the tide of the war. What they found amid the wreckage of the command deck was not a triumphant Dark Lord, but a scene of utter devastation, and, amidst it, a single broken body, its life force flickering so faintly in the Force, it was almost extinguished. It was Revan. But not as anyone knew him, not as a symbol of terror or strategic genius, but as a mortally wounded man, and in a moment it was a complex mixture of compassion, Jedi duty, and strategic curiosity. Bastila Shan made a choice that would alter the fate of the galaxy for centuries. She knelt beside the broken form, and acting on an instinct she did not fully understand, she used her own life force, forging a desperate, unprecedented, and incredibly dangerous force bond with the dying man, pouring her energy into him, stabilizing his ruined body, but further scrambling his already shattered mind. She saved the vessel from destruction, but in doing so, ensured its contents, the mind and memories of Revan, would be forever changed, lost, waiting to be rediscovered. The Immediate aftermath of the betrayal was chaos on a galactic scale. A shockwave of disbelief and paranoia that radiated out from the Quilly system at the speed of subspace communication. The Sith fleet, moments from securing a decisive, war-ending victory, was thrown into instant, violent disarray. The sudden, shocking attack on their own flagship by Malak's vessel created a climate of such intense, immediate paranoia that it shattered unit cohesion entirely. Captains and commanders who had for months taken orders from both lords now found themselves in an impossible position, forced to choose sides in a civil war that had begun without warning, and they chose based on fear, on ambition, or on simple, primal self-preservation. Some, those loyal to Revan's vision, or simply horrified by the act of fratricide, turned their guns on the interrogator, opening fire on their former comrades. Others, seeing the sudden, brutal shift in power, smelling the opportunity for advancement in the new regime, threw their lot in with the stronger, more brutally decisive victor. The fleet fractured there, and then, above Quilly, turning certain victory into a bloody, self-destructive melee within a matter of minutes, brother against brother, ship against ship. In a horrific spectacle of self-immolation, the Republic forces, witnessing this sudden, inexplicable implosion of their seemingly invincible enemy, seized the opportunity to withdraw. They limped from the system, battered and bloodied, but crucially intact, carrying with them the unbelievable, confusing reports of a Sith fleet tearing itself apart from within. Malak, aboard the interrogator, did not pursue them. He was too busy consolidating his sudden, stolen power, too busy reveling in the intoxicating feeling of absolute supremacy. He declared himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith over all fleet-wide channels, his voice booming with a triumphant fury, and he demanded absolute, immediate loyalty from the remnants of the fleet. Those who refused were destroyed without mercy. Those who hesitated were given to the interrogators and torture droids for re-education. Those who pledged themselves were rewarded with promises of plunder, promotion and power. Malak had what he thought he wanted: the throne, the title, the fleet, the fear of his subordinates. But in his lust for the symbol of power, he had completely failed to understand its source, its purpose, its design. He had seized the most powerful weapon ever conceived in the galaxy, but he had no manual, no blueprint, no understanding of what it was for. He saw only the sharpness of the edge, not the direction it was meant to be pointed. This was the true, catastrophic failure, the existential doom that Malak's betrayal brought upon the entire galaxy. He had shattered a complex, long-term, galaxy-spanning strategy he was too short-sighted and self-involved to even comprehend. Revan's empire was not built for conquest alone. It was built for survival, for a specific, defined purpose. Every subjugated world was a resource node to be mobilized. Every ship was a soldier to be deployed, not against the Republic, but against the true existential threat of the Sith Empire of Vitiate, waiting in the dark. The calculated brutality, the efficient tyranny, the entire architecture of fear and order was designed to create a unified, militarized, hardened galaxy capable of withstanding an onslaught that would make the Mandalorian Wars look like a peaceful border negotiation. Malak, in his simplistic, avaricious worldview, saw only the surface. He saw the power, the fear, the dominance. He saw the empire as a crown to be worn, a feast to be consumed, not as a shield to be raised, a medicine to be administered under his rule. The Sith Empire instantly devolved from a purposeful weapon into an engine of pure, chaotic, and short-sighted conquest. The long-term preparation for the true war was abandoned entirely. A strategic focus on logistics, unity, and industrial mobilization was replaced by a policy of wanton destruction and immediate plunder. The goal was no longer to forge a unified weapon for a future war of survival, but to simply take everything, now for himself. The subtle, pervasive psychological manipulation of populations was replaced with overt, crude terror, the careful preservation of infrastructure and industry was replaced with devastating orbital bombardments that ruined the very resources they needed. The Empire became everything Revan had tried to avoid, a perfect mirror of the very chaos, short-sightedness, and self-destructive greed he had sought to protect the galaxy from. The greatest, most tragic irony was that Malak, in his violent bid for power, never knew what he had truly destroyed. He thought he had killed a rival, a mentor who had outlived his usefulness. He had, in fact, doomed the entire galaxy to eventual extinction by single-handedly dismantling its only possible defense. He had taken a meticulously crafted, balanced, and razor-sharp sword designed to parry a specific mortal thrust from a known enemy, and turned it into a crude, clumsy bludgeon, useful only for smashing what was immediately, stupidly in front of it. The betrayal at Quilly was the moment the galaxy truly fell, not to the Sith, but to oblivion, for the only path to salvation was lost. The architect was gone, his blueprints destroyed, and the true enemy, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, watching from the silent, dark depths of the unknown regions, would have allowed himself a cold, satisfied, and utterly contemptuous smile. His manipulation had been perfect. Elegant in its simplicity, he had used the Mandalorians as a blunt instrument to test the Republic's strength. And then he had used Revan, a far sharper tool, to begin its unification into a weapon he could later seize for his own use. But Revan had proven too strong-willed, too independent, too potentially dangerous, a tool that might cut the hand that wielded it. So Vitiate, the master manipulator, had simply whispered to the weaker mind, to the simpler tool, to Malak. He had stoked the flames of ambition and resentment that he knew burned there, and he had let the tool break itself. The threat of a unified, hardened galaxy under a strategic genius like Revan was neutralized, replaced by a galaxy divided between a brutal, predictable thug and a decaying, incompetent republic. It was a perfect scenario for a conqueror. The stage was now set not for a war between giants, but for a harvest, and the reaper, patient and eternal, could afford to wait a little longer. The betrayal at Quilly did not just doom the galaxy to a bitter civil war. It doomed it to a far darker future, a future without a shield, without a plan, without hope, and the man who caused it all, Darth Malak, never once, not in his most quiet moment, understood the breathtaking, apocalyptic magnitude of his failure. The Sith Empire of Darth Revan was not a monolith, though to the terrified citizens of the Republic, watching from their worlds as the black-hulled fleets darkened their skies, it appeared as an indivisible, inexorable wave of darkness, a single-minded, faceless engine of conquest that moved with a chilling, unified purpose. From within, however, from the command decks of its flagships to the stormtrooper barracks on 1,000 occupied worlds, it was a tense, precarious, and ultimately unstable synthesis of two opposing forces, two conflicting, irreconcilable philosophies of power that were bound together only by the immense, terrifying will and unparalleled strategic genius of its architect. This was the fundamental, fatal flaw in Revan's grand design, a crack in the foundation of the dark edifice he was building, a schism that the hidden true enemy, the Sith Emperor Vitiate, perceived across the vast, lightless gulf of space with the cold, patient clarity of a master predator sensing a deep, septic weakness in its chosen prey. On one side was the cold, purposeful, utilitarian vision of Darth Revan, a vision of the Empire not as a kingdom, but as a weapon, a necessary, temporary evil forged in the fires of a greater, ultimate good, a tool to be used with precision, maintained with ruthless efficiency, and then, perhaps one day, when its grim purpose was finally served, set aside, its architect retiring from the stage of history, his name cursed, but his work, the salvation of all life, complete. On the other side, burning with the heat of 1,000 suns, was the hot, passionate, and utterly avaricious ambition of Darth Malak, a vision of the Empire as an end in itself, a glorious bloody testament to personal strength, a throne of skulls from which to rule a conquered galaxy for its own sake. For the glory, the pleasure, the absolute indulgence of dominion, this fundamental schism, this philosophical civil war fought in the hearts of the two men at the Empire's core, was its original sin, a flaw that would not only unravel the Empire from within, but would, in a single, catastrophic moment, render the entire galactic-scale project null and void, sacrificing the future on the altar of present petty ambition. The Empire was not yet a full-year-old. Its conquests were proceeding with a speed and efficiency that stunned and demoralized the Galactic Republic. But it was already dying from within, rotting from the core outward, like a fruit whose seed had been poisoned at the moment of its planting, and the catalyst for its final dramatic collapse would not be a brilliant Republic counteroffensive, not a heroic last stand, but the catastrophic, intimate failure of the bond between the two men who had built it, a bond forged in the fires of the Mandalorian Wars, tempered in the unknown regions, and now shattered by the very dark side power they had sought to harness. The setting for this act of galactic self-destruction was the Quilly system, a strategically vital nexus of hyperlanes on the edge of the mid-rim, a linchpin whose control meant dominance over the flow of warships, supplies, and information into an entire quadrant of the Republic. It was a prize the Republic military, despite its losses and confusion, knew it could not afford to lose, and so they had committed a significant portion of their remaining battle-hardened fleet to its defense, a desperate gamble to blunt the Sith advance. Arrayed against them was the main battle fleet of the Sith Empire, a vast armada of dark, silent ships led by the twin pillars of the New Order. Revan's flagship, the Leviathan, a vessel that had become a legend of terror, and Malak's command ship, the Interrogator, a name that spoke volumes about its master's preferred methods. The battle itself was a brutal, magnificent, and terrible microcosm of the entire war. A swirling, chaotic melee of flashing turbolasers and dying ships, of brave, desperate Republic charges meeting cold, calculated Sith kill zones, Republic tenacity, and courage meeting Sith technological superiority and relentless, dispassionate aggression. From the isolated, quiet bridge of the Leviathan, Revan was a study in focused, almost detached intensity. His mind, an engine of unparalleled strategic computation, was not solely on the immediate tactical situation of the Kelly engagement, which was well in hand, proceeding along the predictable vectors he had foreseen, but was already 3 moves ahead, calculating the next phase, the movement of fleets to exploit this inevitable victory, the political subversion of the surrounding sectors that would now be cut off and ripe for the taking, the resource allocation needed to repair and redeploy. He was playing a game of Dejarik on a galactic scale, and the Quilly battle was but a single, albeit important, piece being moved into place. He was distant, absorbed, his attention turned inward to the vast, 4-dimensional strategic map that only he could see, a map that included always the true, hidden enemy waiting in the dark, the Sith Empire of Vitiate, the real war for which all this was merely preparation, this necessary distraction, this critical focus on the long game, created a momentary vulnerability, a tiny window of time where the architect was not looking directly at the tool in his hand, and the tool, sensing the lapse, its own edge honed by ambition and dark side whispers, decided it wished to become the hand. Aboard the Interrogator, the atmosphere was entirely different. Darth Malak was in his element. He thrived in the visceral chaos of battle, the roar of the engines, the shudder of the deck plating under his boots as the forward batteries fired, the primal thrill of seeing Republic ships break apart and vaporize under the concentrated assault of his command. He paced the bridge like a caged rancor, radiating raw, aggressive energy, barking orders, demanding faster firing solutions, closer engagement ranges. He was the embodiment of the Sith war machine's fist, but beneath the surface exhilaration, beneath the warrior's joy, was a deeper, more corrosive, and ever-growing emotion, a festering resentment that had been planted during the long, lonely journey into the unknown regions and had been fed ever since by the addictive energies of the Starforge and the intoxicating nectar of absolute power. He saw the respect, the awe, the sheer terror that Revan commanded from a distance. He saw the empire they had built together, an empire he had fought for, bled for, whose victories he had personally carved out with his own lightsaber, and he wanted it, not as a steward for Revan's grand, obscure, and seemingly endless design, but as his own, solely, completely, the dark side energy that saturated every bolt and beam of the interrogator, which he had embraced wholly and without Revan's philosophical reservations or ultimate purpose, fed this resentment, twisting it from a petty jealousy into an all-consuming, blinding hunger. It whispered to him in the silence between explosions. It spoke of his own strength, of his right to rule, of Revan's weakness in clinging to his old, Jedi-like obsession with a greater good that always seemed to recede over the horizon. It told him that the strong should rule, that power was its own justification, and that he, Malak, was strong. Revan's distant, commanding demeanor, his cryptic pronouncements about a true war that never materialized, his refusal to simply enjoy the fruits of their conquest, all seemed to Malak like the excuses of a leader who was losing his nerve, who was becoming philosophical, weak, unfit to wield the absolute power he commanded. In that specific, fateful moment, watching the Leviathan through the main viewport, a perfect, isolated island of command amidst the chaotic sea of battle, the whispers became a deafening scream in his mind. The festering resentment crystallized into a cold, clear decision. It was not a complex, long-plotted conspiracy, not a carefully orchestrated coup involving dozens of co-conspirators. It was the impulsive, brutally simple act of a man who saw a fleeting opportunity for ultimate power and was too blinded by his own ambition and the dark side's urgings to consider the consequences beyond his own ascension. The order was given, not after long deliberation or a weighing of risks, but in a hot, passionate instant of absolute avarice. Malak turned to his chief weapons officer, his face a terrifying mask of furious determination, and pointed a single accusatory finger at the image of the Leviathan. His voice, when he spoke, was low, guttural, charged with enough dark side energy to make the air crackle. That ship now, full forward barrage. Concentrate all fire on the command deck. I want it vaporized. The order was so shocking, so utterly insane, that for a long frozen moment, the entire bridge crew of the interrogator simply stared, their hands hovering over consoles, their minds refusing to process the command. They looked at their lord, then at the flagship of their own fleet, the vessel of the Dark Lord himself, then back at Malak's enraged face. Surely they had misheard. It was a trick, a test of loyalty, a terrible joke, but Malak's following roar brooked no hesitation. It was a wave of pure hatred that washed over them. Now fire, or I will space every one of you worthless vermin and fire the gun myself. The threat was terrifyingly real. His rage was a physical force in the cramped bridge, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The weapons officer, a man whose name history would not record, a man faced with the immediate certainty of a painful, ignoble death or the commission of an unthinkable, traitorous act, chose to live, his hands shaking so violently he could barely input the commands. He bypassed the friendly transponder codes that identified the Leviathan as an ally. He overrode the safety protocols designed to prevent such fratricide. He locked the targeting scanners on the ship's bridge, on the very heart of the Sith Empire, and with a final silent prayer to any god that might be listening, he pressed the firing. Control the interrogator's entire forward battery. A massive array of turbo lasers and ion cannons designed to punch through the heaviest capital ship shields erupted in a single coordinated volley of crimson energy. The bolts, a storm of focused annihilation, crossed the short, treacherous distance between the two Sith ships in a heartbeat. They did not splash harmlessly against shields that had been set to allow friendly vessels to approach. They struck home with the force of a small asteroid impact. The command deck of the Leviathan, the nerve center of the entire Sith War effort, the place where Revan's grand design was conceived and executed, ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant, along with everyone on it. The navigators, the tactical officers, the guards, all were turned to atoms in a flash of light. Or so Malak believed, convinced that his decisive act had cleared his path to the throne. On the Leviathan, the world did not so much dissolve as it was unmade. The impact was not a mere hit from an enemy weapon. It was an amputation, a decapitation. The heart and brain of the ship were torn out in a cataclysm of fire and screaming metal. The alarms that had been blaring for the external Republic battle were instantly drowned out by the closer, more intimate screams of rupturing durasteel, exploding power conduits, and dying men and women. The ship, suddenly without guidance, its helm controls vaporized, lurched violently like a wounded beast, throwing crewmen against walls, into sparking consoles. The main lights flickered and died, plunging the cavernous interior into a hellish darkness, punctuated only by the frantic red glow of emergency strips and the angry, spitting sparks of severed cables in the midst of this chaos. Amid the smoke and the screams, Revan was thrown from his command chair by the concussive force of the blast, his body saved from immediate incineration, not by foresight or force of will, but by the simple, brutal, and random laws of physics. The angle of the blast, the specific layout of the reinforced bulkheads around the command walkway, the sheer random chance of where he was standing at that precise microsecond. He was not killed, but he was critically, terribly wounded, his body broken, his famous imposing armor scorched and cracked like a piece of discarded pottery, and most crucially, his mind, that brilliant, unparalleled strategic instrument that held the entire complex plan for galactic salvation, was shattered by the combined force of the physical explosion and the profound psychic backlash of such an intimate, devastating betrayal. The intricate, vast tapestry of memory, identity, purpose, and strategy that was Revan was torn to shreds, unraveled in an instant, leaving behind a blank, smoking slate. A void where a galaxy-spanning consciousness had once resided dot in the ensuing confusion. As the Leviathan drifted, crippled and dying, a ghost ship filled with the moans of the wounded and the hiss of escaping atmosphere, a Republic boarding party led by the young, determined Jedi Knight Bastila Shan, whose unique battle meditation had been a key factor in holding the Republic line, managed to fight their way through the disorganized Sith defenders and onto the ship. Their mission, a desperate, high-risk gamble, had been to capture or kill the Sith Lord himself, to decapitate the Empire in one bold stroke and hopefully turn the tide of the war. What they found amid the wreckage of the command deck was not a triumphant Dark Lord, but a scene of utter devastation, and, amidst it, a single broken body, its life force flickering so faintly in the Force, it was almost extinguished. It was Revan, but not as anyone knew him, not as a symbol of terror or strategic genius, but as a mortally wounded man, and in a moment that was a complex mixture of compassion, Jedi duty, and strategic curiosity. Bastila Shan made a choice that would alter the fate of the galaxy for centuries. She knelt beside the broken form, and acting on an instinct she did not fully understand, she used her own life force, forging a desperate, unprecedented, and incredibly dangerous force bond with the dying man, pouring her energy into him, stabilizing his ruined body, but further scrambling his already shattered mind. She saved the vessel from destruction, but in doing so, ensured its contents, the mind and memories of Revan would be forever changed, lost, waiting to be rediscovered. The immediate aftermath of the betrayal was chaos on a galactic scale, a shockwave of disbelief and paranoia that radiated out from the Quili system at the speed of subspace communication. The Sith fleet, moments from securing a decisive war-ending victory, was thrown into instant, violent disarray. The sudden, shocking attack on their own flagship by Malak's vessel created a climate of such intense, immediate paranoia that it shattered unit cohesion entirely. Captains and commanders who had for months taken orders from both lords now found themselves in an impossible position, forced to choose sides in a civil war that had begun without warning, and they chose based on fear, on ambition, or on simple, primal self-preservation. Some, those loyal to Revan's vision, or simply horrified by the act of fratricide, turned, their guns on the interrogator, opening fire on their former comrades. Others, seeing the sudden, brutal shift in power, smelling the opportunity for advancement in the new regime, threw their lot in with the stronger, more brutally decisive victor. The fleet fractured there and then above Quili, turning certain victory into a bloody, self-destructive melee within a matter of minutes. Brother against brother, ship against ship, in a horrific spectacle of self-immolation. The Republic forces, witnessing this sudden, inexplicable implosion of their seemingly invincible enemy, seized the opportunity to withdraw. They limped from the system, battered and bloodied, but crucially intact, carrying with them the unbelievable, confusing reports of a Sith fleet tearing itself apart from within. Malak, aboard the interrogator, did not pursue them. He was too busy consolidating his sudden, stolen power, too busy reveling in the intoxicating feeling of absolute supremacy. He declared himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith over all fleet-wide channels, his voice booming with a triumphant fury, and he demanded absolute, immediate loyalty from the remnants of the fleet. Those who refused were destroyed without mercy. Those who hesitated were given to the interrogators and torture droids for re-education. Those who pledged themselves were rewarded with promises of plunder, promotion, and power. Malak had what he thought he wanted: the throne, the title, the fleet, the fear of his subordinates. But in his lust for the symbol of power, he had completely failed to understand its source, its purpose, its design. He had seized the most powerful weapon ever conceived in the galaxy, but he had no manual, no blueprint, no understanding of what it was for. He saw only the sharpness of the edge, not the direction it was meant to be pointed. This was the true, catastrophic failure, the existential doom that Malak's betrayal brought upon the entire galaxy. He had shattered a complex, long-term, galaxy-spanning strategy he was too short-sighted and self-involved to even comprehend. Revan's empire was not built for conquest alone. It was built for survival, for a specific, defined purpose. Every subjugated world was a resource node to be mobilized. Every ship was a soldier to be deployed, not against the Republic, but against the true existential threat of the Sith Empire of Vitiate, waiting in the dark. The calculated brutality, the efficient tyranny, the entire architecture of fear and order was designed to create a unified, militarized, hardened galaxy capable of withstanding an onslaught that would make the Mandalorian Wars look like a peaceful border negotiation. Malak, in his simplistic, avaricious worldview, saw only the surface. He saw the power, the fear, the dominance. He saw the empire as a crown to be worn, a feast to be consumed, not as a shield to be raised, a medicine to be administered under his rule. The Sith Empire instantly devolved from a purposeful weapon into an engine of pure, chaotic, and short-sighted conquest, the long-term preparation. For the true war was abandoned entirely. The strategic focus on logistics, unity, and industrial mobilization was replaced by a policy of wanton destruction and immediate plunder. The goal was no longer to forge a unified weapon for a future war of survival, but to simply take everything, now, for himself. The subtle, pervasive psychological manipulation of populations was replaced with overt, crude terror. The careful preservation of infrastructure and industry was replaced with devastating orbital bombardments that ruined the very resources they needed. The Empire became everything Revan had tried to avoid, a perfect mirror of the very chaos, short-sightedness, and self-destructive greed he had sought to protect the galaxy from. The greatest, most tragic irony was that Malak, in his violent bid for power, never knew what he had truly destroyed. He thought he had killed a rival, a mentor who had outlived his usefulness. He had, in fact, doomed the entire galaxy to eventual extinction by single-handedly dismantling its only possible defense. He had taken a meticulously crafted, balanced, and razor-sharp sword designed to parry a specific mortal thrust from a known enemy, and turned it into a crude, clumsy bludgeon, useful only for smashing what was immediately, stupidly in front of it. The betrayal at Queely was the moment the galaxy truly fell, not to the Sith, but to oblivion, for the only path to salvation was lost. The architect was gone, his blueprints destroyed, and the true enemy, the Sith Emperor vitiate, watching from the silent, dark depths of the unknown regions, would have allowed himself a cold, satisfied, and utterly contemptuous smile. His manipulation had been perfect. Elegant in its simplicity, he had used the Mandalorians as a blunt instrument to test the Republic's strength. And then he had used Revan, a far sharper tool, to begin its unification into a weapon he could later seize for his own use. But Revan had proven too strong-willed, too independent, too potentially dangerous, a tool that might cut the hand that wielded it. So Vitiate, the master manipulator, had simply whispered to the weaker mind. To the simpler tool, to Malak, he had stoked the flames of ambition and resentment that he knew burned there. And he had let the tool break itself. The threat of a unified, hardened galaxy under a strategic genius like Revan was neutralized, replaced by a galaxy divided between a brutal, predictable thug and a decaying, incompetent republic. It was a perfect scenario for a conqueror. The stage was now set not for a war between giants, but for a harvest, and the reaper, patient and eternal, could afford to wait a little longer. The betrayal at Queely did not just doom the galaxy to a bitter civil war, it doomed it to a far, darker future, a future without a shield, without a plan, without hope, and the man who caused it all, Darth Malak, never once, not in his most quiet moment, understood the breathtaking, apocalyptic magnitude of his failure. Consciousness did not return to him like a dawn, but like a faulty light flickering in a cavern of pain. It was a fractured, disorienting emergence into a reality that had no context, no past, no anchor points. The man who woke up was not anyone. He was a vessel of raw sensation, a collection of agonies adrift on a formless sea of nothingness. His mind was not a room that had been emptied of its furniture, but a city that had been scoured by a nuclear wind, leaving behind only a flattened, featureless plain where structures of memory and identity had once stood. The first sensation was a throbbing, all-encompassing agony that seemed to radiate from the very core of his being. A symphony of pain with no conductor, no sheet music, and no memory of the melody that had preceded this catastrophic silence. It was a pain that was both physical, a body screaming from catastrophic trauma, and metaphysical, a soul feeling the profound emptiness where a lifetime of experiences should have been. Then, layered over this base note of suffering, came the sounds, the distant, metallic groaning of a ship's hull straining against some unseen pressure, the steady, insistent beep of a medical monitor tracking the fragile rhythm of a life it barely recognized, the low, omnipresent hum of an energy field containing him. And then, cutting through the fog like a blade, a voice, calm, female, possessed of an authority that was both innate and practiced. "He's awake. Inform the Jedi Council immediately. And keep a full Medroid suite on standby." The words were sounds, signifiers without signifieds. Jedi was a phonetic pattern that held no meaning. An empty cup offered to a man dying of thirst. He tried to force his eyes open. A Herculean effort that sent fresh waves of fire through his skull. The light, even the dimmed medbay lighting, was a shard of glass stabbing into his brain. He tried to move a hand, to lift his head, but his body was a prison of synth flesh. Bandages, biostabilizers, and neural inhibitors. He was a consciousness, a spark of awareness, trapped in a broken, unresponsive machine with no manual, no history, no name, no self. The woman, the owner of the voice, was a constant presence in the hazy dreamscape of his recovery. She was young, her face a striking balance of sharp, determined features and an underlying compassion that she seemed to wrestle with. She carried herself with a posture that spoke of discipline and a burden of command. Her presence in the Force, though he did not yet have the words for it, was a point of intense, focused calm in the terrifying void of his existence. Her name, he learned through the fog of sedatives and pain, was Bastila Shan, and she was a Jedi, a word that began over. Days and weeks, to gather a faint, nebulous meaning. It became associated with safety, with a rigid order, with a quiet, potent power he could feel emanating from her like a low-grade magnetic field. She spoke to him in measured, carefully chosen tones, explaining that he had been rescued from the wreckage of a terrible battle, that his ship had been destroyed, that he had been gravely, almost mortally injured, that the Jedi were protecting him, healing him. She was meticulous in her omissions. She did not tell him who he was, where he was from, or what his role in the battle had been. And in his addled, infantile state, it did not occur to him to ask. His identity was a negative space, an absence he could not yet perceive because he had no concept of what should be there to miss. His world had shrunk to the four sterile walls of the medbay, the whirring, impersonal routine of the medical droids, and the visits from Bastila, who began subtly, insidiously to teach him. She called it mental discipline, exercises to control the pain, to focus the mind, to build walls against the terror of his emptiness. But he would later understand it was the first, cautious, manipulative steps back into the Force, a path he walked blindly, without knowing he had once been a master of its every secret. This Force, to him, felt new, a gentle warmth, a current of energy he could tentatively tap into to soothe his aching body, to find a moment's peace from the confusion. It held no history, no darkness, no echoes of grandeur or atrocity. It was a tool, and he was a child learning its most basic use for what felt like the first time. This period of convalescence was a cocoon, a fragile, artificial piece constructed and maintained by the Jedi Council. It possessed a weapon of unimaginable value, intelligence coup that defied belief. Darth Revan, the architect of the galaxy's terror, alive, helpless, and mind-wiped, a blank slate upon which they could, perhaps, write a redemption story. But he was also a bomb that could detonate at any moment, a sleeping dragon whose awakening would spell their doom. Their strategy, conceived in fear and a desperate hope, was one of cautious, deliberate manipulation. They would not tell him of his past. They would show him. They would teach him to fear the man he had been, to reject the darkness so utterly and completely that if it ever did return, he would himself be its greatest enemy. They presented him with a narrative, a carefully curated story of a brilliant, promising Jedi Knight who had been corrupted by war, who had succumbed to pride and power, who had become a monster named Revan, a betrayer of his friends, a conqueror of worlds, a fiend whose name was synonymous with terror and suffering across the galaxy. They spoke of this Revan in hushed, grave tones during his lessons, a living cautionary tale, and the amnesiac, this perfect blank slate, Absorbed it all, he felt a distant, academic horror at the deeds described, a profound pity for the Jedi who had fallen so far from grace. He learned to shudder at the name Revan, to see it as the ultimate symbol of corruption and failure. All the while, the man they described felt like a stranger, a grotesque character from a particularly dark history book, utterly disconnected from the man lying in the medbay, struggling to levitate a cup of water with a focus that made his temples sweat. The journey that followed was not a military campaign, but a pilgrimage into shadow, a voyage into the heart of his own forgotten legend, the Jedi Council. In their profound cunning, a cunning that bordered on the very manipulation they feared, decided that the amnesiac needed to see the galaxy, to witness firsthand the scale of the evil he had wrought, and more importantly, to see the Jedi Code. In action, healing the wounds he had caused, Bastila Shan was assigned as his keeper, his guide and his chain, the force bond between them, the very thing that had siphoned her life energy to save his, now served as a leash, a constant, intimate tether that allowed her to monitor his emotions, his subconscious impulses, to sense any flicker of the old, dreaded identity returning. It was a violation and a salvation all at once. They traveled to worlds freshly scarred by the Sith War, and everywhere they went, the amnesiac was haunted, not by memories, but by echoes, by the ghost of the man he could not remember being, a phantom that everyone else seemed to recognize in his shadow. On the windy, grassy plains of Dantuan, at the secluded Jedi enclave, the haunting was academic, intellectual, a thing of theory and lesson. He was taught the basics of the Force, as a novice would be, the same simple exercises given to younglings, practicing telekinesis on rocks in the groves, while the Jedi Masters Vrook, Zar, Vander spoke in hushed, fearful tones in the next room of the man he could not remember being, their anxiety a palpable force that pressed against the tranquility of the place. He learned lightsaber forms from a Twi'lek Jedi, his body moving with an uncanny, instinctual grace that surprised his instructors, a muscle memory buried deep in his tissue that persisted where conscious memory had failed. He discussed philosophy with Master Zar, who looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and even more profound anxiety, as if waiting for a bomb to detonate in his meditation garden. Here, the ghost of Revan was a theory, a subject of study, a dark path he was being taught to avoid, a cautionary tale he was told he had narrowly escaped. On the sun-scorched, twin-sunned dunes of Tatooine, the echo was different. It was a whisper of strategy, of a mind that thought in terms of angles, advantages, and resource allocation. While searching for a missing Jedi in the wastes, he found himself offering insights into the movements and social structure of the Sand People, understanding their hit-and-run tactics, their territorial patterns, their cultural triggers, with a clarity that felt instinctive, not learned. It was a cold, analytical part of his mind clicking into gear, a gear he didn't know he possessed. He could almost sense the optimal paths through the endless dune seas, the best places for an ambush, the weaknesses in a settlement's defense. It was a familiar, comfortable way of thinking that had no origin in his new life. It was the ghost of the general, the master tactician, whispering from the void, offering advice on a campaign he didn't know he had fought. In the shadowy, treacherous, and suffocatingly humid depths of the Wookiee world of Kashyyyk, the haunting took a darker, more visceral turn. The Shadowlands felt oppressively, eerily familiar. The primordial darkness there felt like an old cloak, something he had worn before, something that fit him too well. The terrible presence of the mad Jedi Jolee Bindo spoke of, the one who had fallen to the dark side and corrupted the ancient computer, unleashing a horror upon the Wookiees, felt like a deed done by another self, a terrible sin whose psychic weight he could feel pressing on him, but could not remember committing. The ghost here was not a strategist, but a perpetrator, a violator, a bringer of corruption. On the watery, politically complex world of Manon, with its strict neutrality and Byzantine legal system, the Echo was one of manipulation, of moving pieces on a galactic board. He found himself easily navigating the lies and half-truths of the Selkath, understanding the unspoken rules of their court, playing the Sith representatives and the Republic officials against each other with a skill that felt born of long, expert practice. He knew just what to say, what to promise, what to withhold. To get the results he needed, the ghost here was the politician, the spy master, the man who knew that truth was a malleable tool to be wielded, not an immutable principle to be upheld. And then there was Korriban, the ancient, blood-soaked homeworld of the Sith, the heart of darkness itself, a place that felt less like a planet and more like a sentient wound in the Force. Here, the haunting was no longer an echo or a whisper. It was a deafening scream that resonated in his very bones from the moment he set foot on the red, dusty soil, the air itself thick and heavy with the psychic residue of millennia of hatred, ambition, and suffering. He felt a sickening, undeniable sense of homecoming, a part of him relaxing into an environment it recognized on a primal level. The Sith Academy was a nest of vipers, a chaotic and brutal hierarchy where each student and master vied for power through betrayal and cruelty. And he, the amnesiac Jedi spy, found himself moving through their midst, not as an outsider, but like a master returned. He understood their games, their cruel philosophies, their desperate, pathetic thirst for power. Because the ghost within him understood it perfectly, instinctively, the Sith, with their attunement to the dark side, did not see a Jedi novice. They saw a kindred spirit, a dormant predator, a sleeping giant. They praised him, they feared him, they sought to recruit him. They spoke of Darth Revan with a reverence that was terrifying in its intensity. They held him up as a dark messiah, the greatest Dark Lord in 1,000 years, the hope of the Sith. And they praised the amnesiac to his face for the very sins he had been taught by the Jedi to despise, for the genocide at Telos, for the brutal, beautiful efficiency of his campaigns, for the cunning of his strategies. They recited his old speeches, debated his philosophies of war. On Korriban, the ghost was not a memory. It was a living, breathing presence, a mask everyone insisted was his true face, and the intense, unbearable conflict between the man he was trying so hard to become, the Jedi, the hero, the savior, and the man everyone, from his enemies to the very walls of the tombs, claimed he had been, created a psychic agony that threatened to tear his mind apart at the seams. He was being told by his allies to fear and reject the monster, while his enemies were simultaneously offering him the monster's crown and begging him to wear it again. This entire, surreal, and psychologically torturous pilgrimage. Bastila was his constant companion, his anchor to the present, and the mirror in which he saw his best possible self. Their Force bond deepened from a simple tether into a complex, profound conduit of shared emotion, of unspoken understanding, of flickering images and feelings that passed between them in moments of stress or quiet, and of a profound, unacknowledged tension. She was his jailer, his warden, tasked with the terrible responsibility of ensuring the monster did not awake. But she was also his protector, his teacher, his staunchest defender against the Council's doubts, and despite herself, his friend. She saw the genuine goodness in him, the quick wit, the courage, the innate, powerful desire to help and protect. That defined his new self. She argued with the Council on Dantwan, advocating for him, believing in the man he was now, even as she watched him for any sign of the man he had been. Her fear and her hope were at constant war within her. The amnesiac, in turn, found himself inextricably drawn to her strength, her unwavering conviction, her light. She represented everything the Jedi said he had betrayed, everything he was now striving to be, everything that felt pure and right in a universe that seemed determined to show him its darkness. Their relationship was a fragile, impossible lifeline, thrown across. An abyss of forgotten sin, a connection that was the most real, the most solid thing in his world of ghosts. Echoes and lies. He began, painstakingly, to piece together a new identity, not from the shards of memory, but from action and choice. He was a man who helped others, who fought for the weak, who valued life and justice. He was a hero to the people he aided on these worlds. A Jedi indeed, if not in memory or official title. He built this new self on a foundation of compassion, choosing mercy over ruthlessness, cooperation over domination, saving lives over achieving objectives. But this new identity, for all its nobility, was built on a foundation of sand. Every moment of instinctual brilliance in a fight, every flash of strategic insight that solved an impossible problem. Every time he felt the dark, impulsive urge to take the easier, crueler path to a solution, and had to consciously force it down, was a tremor that threatened to bring the entire fragile construct down. He was a woman living in a house, built from the salvage wreckage of a ship she'd never seen, constantly finding parts that didn't fit, components that bore strange, ominous markings from a world she'd never visited. The ghost of Revan was no longer just an external story told by Jedi or Sith. It was becoming an internal pressure, a second consciousness sleeping fitfully within him, its dreams leaking into his own, its skills becoming his instincts, its sins waiting to be remembered, waiting for a key to turn in a lock he didn't. No existed. The amnesiac was on a journey to find a star map, to stop the Sith, to be a hero. But his true, unspoken journey was into the heart of his own darkness, and he was rapidly, inexorably running out of time before the ghost woke up and demanded to know who had built this new life from the ruins of his own. The decision to destroy the Starforge was the new man's first and greatest act of atonement. It was not the act of a Jedi destroying a Sith weapon. It was the act of a man rejecting the darkest part of his own soul, the part that believed. Any atrocity was acceptable for a noble goal. It was the completion of his redemption, not through the death of the old self, but through its integration and ultimate rejection by the new. He would fight Malak, not as a Jedi against a Sith, but as a whole man against the living embodiment of his own worst mistake, the apprentice who had learned all the wrong lessons, the symbol of the Empire's devolution into pointless cruelty. The battle that followed was not just a lightsaber duel. It was a clash of philosophies, of the man who had found a better way against the man who represented the path he had narrowly escaped. And when it was over, when Malak lay defeated, not gloatingly, but with a touch of pity for the lost friend, the choice to destroy the Starforge became the final definitive statement. The new man, forged in the fires of his own past, had chosen life over power, sacrifice over dominion. He had become reforged. The destruction of the Starforge was not an end, but a catastrophic beginning, a seismic event that rippled outwards through the Force, a scream of dying machinery and extinguished dark side energy that was felt as a psychic shockwave by sensitive beings across the galaxy. For the Republic, it was a moment of unparalleled triumph. The seemingly invincible Sith war machine had been decapitated, its endless production lines severed, its dread lord defeated. Celebrations erupted on 1,000 worlds, a cathartic release from years of terror and uncertainty. The name Revan was no longer spoken only with fear, but with a newfound complex reverence. The fallen hero had returned, had sacrificed his dark past to save the present. He was a savior once more, a symbol of redemption, a legend reborn. But for the man at the center of the legend, the victory was hollow, a punctuation mark in a sentence that was far from complete. As the Republic fleet limped home from the ruins of the Lihan system, cheering soldiers surrounding him, he felt not triumph, but a profound and chilling sense of unfinished business. The true enemy, the vast, ancient darkness he had glimpsed years ago, the reason for all of it, still waited, patient and smiling. In the infinite dark, the Republic had won a war, but they had not even begun to prepare for the next one. And he was perhaps the only being in the galaxy who understood the scale of the threat. The knowledge was a weight that crushed all joy from his victory. His attempts to warn them were met with a wall of complacency, willful ignorance, and political exhaustion. The Jedi Council, reassembled on a recovering Dantuan, listened to his accounts of the true Sith Empire with polite, skeptical silence. They saw a man traumatized by his experiences, perhaps still touched by the dark side. His visions of an ancient, hidden empire of unimaginable power seemed like the paranoid fantasies of a soldier who had fought for too long. They urged him to rest, to meditate, to release his fears to the Force. The Senate, drowning in the monumental task of reconstruction, saw only the bottom line, the cost of war, the need for stability. They could not entertain tales of a new, greater threat. It was political suicide. The galaxy was tired. It wanted peace, and it chose to believe that peace had been won. Revan, the prophet of a coming storm, found himself shouting into a void of his own making. He had saved them too well, defeated the immediate threat so completely that they could not conceive of a greater one. His knowledge, the very reason for his fall and redemption, had become a cage, isolating him more completely than any prison cell. This isolation, this desperate need to act where others refused to even see, drove him back to the one place he knew held answers. The unknown regions he left quietly, without fanfare. Telling only a select few of his intentions, he took the Ebon Hawk, not a warship, but a scout vessel, and he journeyed back into the chaotic void, not as a conqueror this time, but as a pilgrim seeking confirmation. He had to know if the Empire was still there, if his memories were true, if the threat was real. He had to see it with his own eyes, to find some proof he could bring back to. Shatter the galaxy's complacency. It was not a mission of war, but of desperate reconnaissance. A lone man sailing into the heart of the hurricane to chart its course. He could not have known that his course had been charted long before. That his return to the place of his damnation was not a secret journey, but a walk into a trap laid centuries in the making. The Sith Emperor Vitiate, a being whose consciousness spanned lifetimes, felt his approach, a familiar, bright spark of will re-entering the outer darkness, and he smiled. The tool had returned, sharper than ever, and now it was time to break it to the hand. The capture was swift, absolute, and utterly humiliating. There was no great battle, no glorious last stand. His ship was simply surrounded by vessels of a design so ancient and advanced they seemed to phase out of the darkness itself. Their technology was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Their crews were silent, masked, moving with a unison that spoke of a hive mind or a will utterly subsumed by another. He was taken not to a cell, but to a place that was the antithesis of a cell. He was brought to the heart of the Sith Empire, to the world of Nathema, or rather, to what was left of it, a world stripped of the Force, a void in the fabric of reality, a place of absolute silence that was more terrifying than any scream. And then to the throne world of Dromund Kaas, a planet shrouded in perpetual storm, where dark side energy was so thick it was difficult to breathe. Here, in a citadel that pierced the angry sky, he was presented before the Sith Emperor, not as a prisoner of war, but as a specimen, a curiosity. Vitiate was not a warrior king. He was something else entirely, a presence of such immense, ancient power that he made Malak look like a child playing with a toy lightsaber. His voice was calm, melodic, and carried the weight of centuries. He did not threaten, he did not torture. He simply conversed. He confirmed everything. He praised Revan's strategic mind, his will, his fascinating attempt to build a rival empire. He spoke of the Mandalorian Wars as a delightful diversion. And then he explained, in chilling, precise detail, his true plan, not conquest, but consumption. A ritual on a galactic scale to devour all life and achieve true immortality. Revan was not an enemy to be defeated. He was a resource to be utilized, a font of knowledge and strength to be drained. His imprisonment was not one of chains and torture racks. It was far more sophisticated, far more cruel. He was placed in a stasis field, not to freeze him, but to preserve him, to keep his mind lucid and aware while his body was rendered immobile. He was not starved or beaten. He was fed, sustained, kept in perfect health so that his connection to the Force remained strong. He was the source, and Vitiate was the siphon. For centuries, the Emperor fed on him, not on his life force, but on his knowledge, his experiences, his strength of will. It was a psychic vampirism of the most intimate kind. Vitiate would wander the halls of Revan's mind, examining his strategies, reliving his memories, tasting his emotions, the love for Bastila, the friendship for Malak, the determination to save the galaxy. All of it became a feast for the ancient being. The torture was not in the taking, but in the helplessness, in the utter, complete violation of his self. He was a book being read over and over, his most private moments made into entertainment for a godlike monster. The process fractured him, not quickly, but slowly, over the relentless, grinding centuries, the immense pressure of Vitiate's consciousness, the constant drain, the unending. Violation could not be withstood by any single mind, not even his. To survive, his psyche split, a desperate defense mechanism against an unstoppable force, the light side of his nature, the new man, the Jedi who had redeemed himself, the part that valued compassion, friendship, and hope, was walled off, buried deep within a fortress of its own making. It became a dormant seed, waiting for a spring that might never come. The dark side, the old man, the Sith Lord, the pragmatist who understood power and necessity, remained on the surface, the part that engaged with the Emperor, that fought a constant, silent war of wills, this dark side fragment, honed by centuries of mental combat with Vitiate, became something else, not Revan, but a reflection of Revan's worst traits, his ruthlessness, his obsession, his belief that any means were justified by the right end, stripped of the balancing weight of his compassion. This dark fragment festered, its purpose mutated from saving the galaxy to destroying. The threat to the galaxy at any cost, even if it meant becoming the very thing he had fought against. He became two entities trapped in one body, a prisoner of his own mind. The light side, the true self, was the man in the iron mask, silent, watching, hoping. The dark side was the warden, the voice that spoke to the Emperor, that plotted, that planned a genocide as the only solution. Vitiate, in his infinite cruelty, enjoyed this internal conflict. He pitted the two halves of Revan against each other, using the dark fragment's fanaticism to fuel his own power while keeping the light fragment trapped in a hell of its own making. The price of Revan's knowledge, of his foresight, was this eternal, internal civil war. He had been broken not through pain, but through his own greatest strength, his unwavering will. Vitiate had used it against him, turning his resolve to save the galaxy into the very chain that bound him. For 300 years, Revan was the Emperor's favorite toy, a testament to his power, and a permanent warning of the cost of defiance. The prophet had become the prisoner, and his warning went unheard, locked away with him in a silent citadel at the edge of the world. The rescue, when it finally came after 3 centuries of silent, psychic torment, was not a grand military operation. It was an accident, a ripple in the pond of galactic events that finally reached the stagnant water of his prison. A Republic Black Ops team led by a man named Mitra Surik the Jedi Exile, another veteran of the Mandalorian Wars, another soul scarred by Malachor V, had been drawn to Dromund Kaz following a trail of dark side, anomalies and whispered intelligence. They were searching for a lost admiral, not a myth. They breached the Citadel's ancient defenses through a combination of forgotten engineering schematics and sheer, desperate force. fighting through legions of Sith assassins and nightmarish creatures bred in the planet's dark jungles. When they found his stasis chamber, they did not see Darth Revan, the legendary savior-turned-conqueror. They saw an artifact, a mummified figure held in a field of crackling energy. Surrounded by arcane machinery that hummed with a malevolent purpose, they shattered the field, not to free a hero, but to deny the Emperor a tool, to disrupt whatever dark ritual was in progress. The moment the field collapsed, the dark side, fragment that had been the warden of his mind for centuries, the ruthless pragmatist, surged into control of the body. The light, the true Revan, was too weak, too atrophied from its long dormancy. It could only watch, a passenger in its own. Flesh, the rescuers expected gratitude, or at least coherence. What they got was a vortex of focused, genocidal intent. The freed prisoner did not ask for news of the galaxy. He did not inquire about Bastila or the fate of the Republic. His first words, rasped from a throat unused to speech, were a demand. The Emperor, he must be destroyed. The Sith Empire must be purged. There is no other way. The galaxy he returned to was unrecognizable. The Republic he had saved had ossified, grown complacent and bureaucratic in its hard-won peace. The Jedi Order, restructured and cautious, was a pale shadow of its former self, and the Sith Empire he had sought to prepare them for was no longer a hidden threat. It had emerged from the shadows, launching a devastating war that had brought the Republic to its knees. His warnings, his entire damned life's work, had been for nothing. They had not listened. They had not prepared. And now the enemy was at the gate, a dark fragment, a part of him that had stewed in Vitiate's presence for 300 years, saw this not as a tragedy, but as a validation, its solution, born from centuries of intimate exposure to the Emperor's absolute evil and the utter failure of half-measures, was horrifying in its simplicity and scale. If the Sith Empire could not be defeated by conventional means, if its culture was so inherently corrupt that its very existence was a cancer on the galaxy, then it had to be excised completely, utterly. He would not fight their armies. He would erase their people. He would use the very weapon he had discovered and rejected a lifetime ago. He would find the Foundry, a massive, ancient space station of Iokath design, similar to the Starforge, but built for a different purpose. Not construction, but replication. It could create an infinite army of hunter-killer droids, programmed for one task: the complete and total genocide of the Sith species. It was the ultimate expression of his old philosophy, the necessary choice, taken to its absolute, logical, and monstrous extreme, a final solution to the problem he had dedicated his existence to solving. This plan was the Dark Fragment's masterpiece, the culmination of its centuries of isolated evolution, stripped of the light side's compassion, of the new man's hard-won belief in redemption. It saw only the equation, the same equation that had justified Malachor V and the Sith Empire. But now, without any limiting factors, billions of Sith lives, many of them innocent, born into the culture Vitiate had created, versus the trillions of other lives in the galaxy that would eventually be consumed. The math was simple, clean, and evil. This was the true victory of Vitiate's torture. It was not just to break Revan, but to corrupt his noble goal into its most horrific possible form, to turn the Savior into a greater monster than the Emperor himself could ever be, to prove that Revan's entire philosophy of necessary evil was a slippery slope that ended only in absolute atrocity. The man who had once embraced the dark side to build an army to save the galaxy now sought to embrace a deeper darkness to build an army to commit genocide. The ends justified the means, and the means were the absolute end of a species. This path inevitably brought him into conflict with the very people who had saved him, with the Republic he claimed to protect, and with Mitra Surik, his old friend, who represented everything his light side still believed in. She saw the madness in his eyes, a single-minded fanaticism that had consumed him. She saw not a hero, but a mirror of the Emperor's own absolute corruption. Their confrontation was not a reunion of old comrades, but a tragic clash of ideologies. His dark fragment saw her and the Jedi as weak, sentimental, doomed to fail as they had failed before. He believed he was the only one strong enough, willing enough to make the hard choice, the final choice. She saw him as lost, his trauma and his time in captivity having twisted his purpose into a grotesque parody of itself. Their conflict was the external manifestation of the civil war that had been raging inside his mind for centuries. The light side, though dormant, fought through her, through its belief in her, and in the end, it was her actions, her refusal to accept his genocidal logic, that began to weaken the dark fragment's hold. She did not defeat him in battle. She appealed to the man she knew was still trapped inside, to the Revan who had chosen redemption on the Starforge. She became the catalyst for the internal struggle he had been avoiding for 300 years. The final battleground was not a star system or a battlefield, but the depths of his own fractured psyche, represented by the ancient Sith world of Yavin 4, a place strong in the dark side, where the barrier between the physical and the spiritual was thin. Here, the two halves of Revan, the light and the dark, the savior and the destroyer, were finally forced to confront each other, not as warden and prisoner, but as equals. The dark fragment, powerful, ruthless, and utterly convinced of its righteous purpose. The light fragment, weakened but unyielding, fortified by the compassion and connections it had forged a lifetime ago. Their reunion was not a gentle merging, but a violent psychic cataclysm, a war for the soul of a man who had become an idea. The dark side argued with the cold logic of the grave, presenting its genocidal plan as the only possible outcome of Revan's life's work. The only way to truly win. The light side argued with the memory of friendship, of love, of the cost of redemption. It showed the dark fragment the faces of those who would be killed, not as abstract numbers in an equation, but as beings with lives, hopes, and futures. It forced the dark fragment to see that in destroying the Sith, it would become something far worse. It would become the ultimate. Fulfillment of vitiates victory, proving that Revan's will, his strength, his very soul, could be utterly corrupted. Perhaps his most enduring and tragic contribution is the concept of the necessary choice, the philosophy that the ends justify the means. He is the ultimate exemplar and the ultimate cautionary tale of this idea at Malachor V, the necessary. Choice saved the Republic and broke the Mandalorians, but it also broke the souls of those who carried it out, paving the road to the dark side in the unknown regions. The necessary choice to embrace the Sith mantle was meant to forge a shield against a greater evil, but it instead created a new, more immediate terror as the broken prophet. The necessary choice of genocide was the ultimate corruption of his original goal, the final, damning proof that the philosophy of necessary evil is a recursive loop that can only end in absolute atrocity. Every time Revan made the hard choice, the pragmatic choice, the choice that sacrificed the few for the many, it created a larger problem that required an even harder, more terrible choice to solve. His life is a devastating critique of utilitarianism on a galactic scale, a demonstration that when one starts calculating the value of lives, one eventually loses the ability to value life at all. And yet, for all the tragedy and failure, his legacy is not one of despair. It is one of enduring, stubborn hope, because woven through the tapestry of his monumental failures are threads of profound connection that even his will and his choices could not sever. His relationship with Bastila Shan is the clearest example. It was a connection that began as a manipulation. A Jedi leash on a monster, it became a lifeline for a lost man, and it endured as a love that spanned the darkness of his fall and the light of his redemption. It was Bastila's faith in the man he could be that helped the amnesiac build anew life, and it was the memory of that love that the light side fragment clung to during centuries of imprisonment. Similarly, his fraught friendship with Moloch is a tragedy of failed connection, a bond that could have been a foundation for greatness, but instead became the fault line that shattered his plans and doomed the galaxy. And his final, silent understanding with Mitra Surik on Yavin 4, a communication that transcended words between two veterans of a war that had never truly ended for either of them. These relationships are the counterpoint to his isolation, the proof that even the most monumental will cannot exist entirely alone, that redemption is never a solitary act, but is always found in the reflection of ourselves we see in others. Ultimately, the legacy of Revan is that of a warning, a permanent, unsettling monument to the perils of foresight and the burden of knowledge. He was the one who saw the avalanche coming when everyone else was admiring the snowfall, and his entire life was a desperate, tragic attempt to get people to move out of the way. His great failure was not his fall, nor his methods, but his inability to make others see what he saw. He was a prophet who was first ignored, then feared, then worshipped, then imprisoned, and finally forgotten, until the avalanche finally arrived. The Galactic Republic, in its comfort and its triumph over Darth Malak, chose the bliss of ignorance over the harsh duty of preparation. They turned their savior into a legend, sanitizing his story into a simple tale of fall and redemption, because the true story, the story of the true war still to come, was too terrible to contemplate. Revan's warning is the most important one for any civilization. The warning that peace is not a permanent state, but a fleeting armistice between conflicts, and that the cost of vigilance is eternal, but the cost of complacency is extinction. In the end, he remains where he always was, on the frontier, not as a conqueror or explorer, but as a guardian, a man who sacrificed everything, his name, his past, his freedom, his very unity of self, to hold back the night for one more day. His final stand was not a victory, but a choice, the last in a long line of necessary choices, the choice to stand watch, to become the barrier himself. His legacy is not a statue on Coruscant or a chapter. In a Jedi text, it is the continued existence of a galaxy that remains, for now, unconsumed. He is the man who made the impossible choices so that others could live to make the easy ones. And his story is a permanent, haunting question, a challenge to every generation. What are you willing to become to protect what you love? And when? Does the protector become the monster? The legend of Revan is not a story about the past. It is a mirror held up to the future. And it asks of us the same question it asked of him, a question for which there is no easy answer, only the enduring, paradoxical echo of a will that tried to find one.